I never imagined the day I'd catch my wife, Laura, in the arms of her boss, Frank. It shattered me, but it also ignited a fire of vengeance I couldn't ignore. She betrayed our love, our vows, everything. I followed them, gathered evidence, and devised a plan. Frank thought he could have it all. My wife, his career. He was wrong. My cruel revenge exposed their affair, destroyed his reputation, and left Laura in ruins. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a tale of retribution. The jury returned with mixed looks. Some stared at the defendant while others looked away. It had been a difficult case. I should know. I'm Patrick Sullivan, the Assistant District Attorney for Van Patten County. I prosecuted Leroy Johnson for assault. He was a dedicated worker, a good father, and until recently a caring husband. Sadly, these qualities didn't help my case. If things had gone differently, Leroy and I might have never crossed paths. I sometimes think about how my life would have changed if that had been true. Leroy worked for a contracting company named Best, Marks, and O'Reilly. He was a union carpenter, respected for the quality of his work and the effort he put in. He worked 60 hours a week to support his family, a wife and 2 kids. Leroy was a shorter, darker-skinned man, about 5'6", but strong from his tough job. On the Friday before Labor Day, the union decided to go on strike because of a painting subcontractor who was not part of the union. It was just one of those things. The general contractor had no choice but to hire a non-union company, and the union couldn't let that go without action. So they all agreed to leave work early that Friday. But they forgot to tell Mrs. Johnson. When Leroy got home 4 hours early, he found his wife in bed with another man. Perhaps Leroy could have avoided the trouble if the man had simply left when Leroy asked him to go. However, this man, who was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 260 pounds, decided to fight back. But he was no match for Leroy, who had been lifting heavy things at work every day. Leroy's first strong punch took the bigger man down. Angry and out of control, Leroy started to hit him repeatedly. Worried that her husband might seriously hurt her lover, Mrs. Johnson tried to step in. As she pulled on Leroy to break it up, he accidentally pushed her hard, and she hit her head against the bed frame. She ended up with a mild concussion. The case against Leroy focused on the injury to his wife. No jury would likely convict him for defending himself against a much larger man. However, laws about domestic violence meant Leroy couldn't completely dodge responsibility for hurting his wife. Still, it was unlikely that a jury would convict him considering the situation. That's where I came in. My boss, Stan Condos, wanted to run for the Supreme Court. He needed to show that he was tough on crime and serious about domestic violence cases. The problem was that he wasn't very good at trial work at all. I got my job in Stan's office because he really needed help with the trials. He gave me the Leroy Johnson case and simply told me to win, no matter how. For the Leroy Johnson trial, I put in my best effort and played my cards right. It would have been easy to turn Leroy into the villain, but that wouldn't work. All 3 of his bosses came to say what a good man he was. When Leroy took the stand, he told the story exactly as it happened, without trying to make himself look any better. I had to work around the fact that he acted under a lot of stress. The trial was tough. When the jury leader stood to read the decision, no one knew what the outcome would be. On the first charge, assault in the first degree, what do you say? Not guilty. On the second charge, assault in the second degree, what do you say? Not guilty. On the third charge, assault in the third degree, what do you say? Guilty. Assault in the third degree is a lesser charge with a maximum punishment of 1 year. I didn't think Judge Anthony Drago would give anything more than probation, especially since Leroy had a family, but the sentencing would come later. At that moment, Stan Condos, the district attorney of Van Patten County, had his win, and that was what counted. I felt relieved the jury didn't come back with harsher charges. I would have felt bad if they had. It was past 7 when I walked out of the courthouse. I was supposed to go to the Christmas party for my wife's firm, which had started at 6 p.m. If I hurried, I could reach the west side of Albany in under 30 minutes. I would be late, but I hoped Laura wouldn't be too upset. Laura and I have been married for almost 5 years. She is nearly 6 years older than me and much more successful. As a financial lawyer at the second largest law firm in New York, she makes over 3 times what I earn. Laura is at the top of her field. A Yale graduate with honors, she has worked at Brentwood and Stringer for 7 years. That's how we met. I was in my second year at Brooklyn Law School when I interviewed for a summer job at her firm. She came to the school to conduct interviews for Brentwood and Stringer. I was the last person she interviewed that day. The placement office had small rooms for interviews, only 8 by 10 feet, with a small table and a few practical chairs. When I entered the room, I was greeted by a very attractive young woman in a dark, pinstriped suit. Her auburn hair fell to her shoulders and framed her smooth neck. She had dark eyes and a warm smile. She stood up and reached out her hand. "Mister, my name is Laura Parker. Thank you for being here," she said. Honestly, I don't remember what I answered. I can only recall taking a deep breath and feeling like I couldn't let it out. I never thought love at first sight was real, but there was something about seeing Laura for the first time that captivated me. Even before I felt this way, I knew the interview was not going well. She asked all the usual questions, and I had practiced my answers even if I was mumbling them. This was meant to be a simple practice session. I was interviewing for a summer intern position at a Wall Street firm, a place that usually only hired students from the Ivy League, not from Brooklyn Law. The interviews were more about courtesy than anything else. It was a way for both the firm and the school to gain experience. The school could say big firms came to visit, and the firms could claim they looked at local schools. It was all a game, and while Laura was getting good at asking questions, my heart raced just being near her. At one point, Laura started asking about Edward Kincaid, a well-known figure and the son of a former senator. She also mentioned Deborah Cassidy, who came from a wealthy background. "I see you're in Edward Kincaid's class?" she asked. "No, he's my mock trial coach. I don't take any classes with him," I replied. My best friend Stephen Fitzgerald and I were part of a great mock trial team. The other team member changed each week depending on who Edward Kincaid chose. Kincaid loved winning, and we were his go-to pair. While Steve and I were not the best students, we shone in the courtroom. Kincaid was fantastic at observing every trial and spotting the mistakes in both sides. He was a great coach, but I felt he could teach without being able to do it himself. I remembered when my dad taught me to swim. I was just a little kid when he took me to the pool. He showed me how to float and kick my legs. Once I got that down, we moved to using my arms. By the time I was 5, I could swim really well. My dad was an excellent teacher, but there was something he never told me. He had a fear that kept him from swimming himself. He knew how to swim in his mind, but he couldn't lift his feet off the bottom of the pool for long. Edward Kincaid knew all the tricks of the trade in law. He taught me some tricks that I had never heard of before, but he never actually took a case himself. "They say he might run for governor," she asked. "I'm not sure about that. All I know is that we have a match against Harvard next week, and Kincaid believes we will win," I answered. She continued to talk about Kincaid, asking me questions for a whole hour. I didn't mind. I was really interested in her. Somehow, I can't pinpoint how it happened, but we ended up going out for drinks after the interview. It was the last interview of the day, and it lasted much longer than I thought it would. She just seemed to enjoy talking. I can't remember inviting her out, but I guess I did. That's how we met. We got married while I was still in law school. She didn't want to wait until I graduated because she was earning good money. She believed we had no reason to delay. By that time, we were already very close, and I felt a sense of duty. I had a strong feeling that she thought my wish to wait meant I was just using her, but that wasn't true. I was very much in love, but I was also scared of the commitment I thought marriage would bring. I was raised Catholic, after all. After I finished school, I followed her to Albany when she took a job with municipal bonds. Laura thought it was a great chance for her to advance in her career. The firm had 7 offices. The Manhattan and Washington offices had the best people from Ivy League schools like Laura, but the smaller offices had less competition. Laura was working in municipal finance, where the profits were small, but the amounts of money involved were huge. For example, 1/3 of a multi-million-dollar personal injury lawsuit sounds great, but the costs are high, and there are many unsuccessful cases for every success. Bonds always pay out, and while 0.5% might seem small, remember that we're talking about billions in bonds. Millions can be made on each deal, where the costs are just paper, ink, and expensive dinners. There are other hidden costs. but those are not openly discussed. Moving to Albany caused a problem for me. There weren't many jobs for lawyers like me who only knew trial techniques. People often misunderstand lawyers. They focus on the famous trial lawyers and don't realize they are as rare as movie stars. Very few succeed, and they often rely on luck as much as skill. Most lawyers avoid the courtroom. I eventually found a part-time job as an assistant district attorney in Van Patten County. They needed someone to cover night court 3 times a week. Laura always worked late, so my night shifts didn't bother her much. When the head trial lawyer at Van Patten passed away unexpectedly, I was offered a full-time position because it became clear that I stood out in the courtroom. For a while, things seemed to be going well for Laura and me. But in the past year, she has been working hard to get a partnership at her firm. She believes that this year is crucial for her career. She also wants to start a family soon. If she gets pregnant before she becomes a partner, it might change things for her. So she has decided to wait until she gets the partnership. At 32, she feels the pressure of time. My role is to be a supportive husband and go to every work event with her. I want to help her by taking care of things at home when the baby comes. I have tried my best to attend social events, but sometimes my job as an attorney gets busy and makes it hard. I don't always work the same hours she does, but when there is a trial, I have to focus on that. Laura tries to understand, but we don't spend much time together. I often work long hours during the day and have to attend night court once or twice a week. She is focused on getting that partnership. She often says, "Just a little longer and we will have everything." I rush to the restaurant where the celebration is happening. It's a large old place off Wolf Road called the Briar Patch, which opened about 30 years ago. They started it by putting together some old train cars. Over time, they built and changed it into a maze of rooms. There's a big main room with a long bar on one side, and several smaller rooms branch off from that like spokes on a wheel. I arrived just before 8. When I walked in, the party was lively. About 100 people from the firm, along with family and friends, were celebrating, but I couldn't find Laura anywhere. I looked around the main room and then began checking the smaller rooms. Just when I was about to give up and call her phone, I walked down a narrow hallway of booths at the end of one of the rooms. It seemed empty, but I noticed it led back into the main room. As I was about to walk through, I heard her voice. "Stop that! Someone will see!" It was Laura, and her words were followed by a giggling laugh. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. My wife didn't sound upset. Quite the opposite. "Come on, Laura, there's no one back here. You know you want me as much as I want you." This voice was deep and confident. "Please, I am married, Frank. My husband could come at any minute. What would he say if he saw you?" Laura replied. "He's not here, and he wouldn't do anything even if he was." I started to move forward, but her next words made me hesitate. "I know he isn't as successful or distinguished as you are, but I don't want to hurt him." They were right in front of me in the booth, but I paused. What did that mean? Did she want this other man more than me? I slid into a booth not far from where they were sitting and leaned back against the wall. You want to be in a partnership, but sometimes that means making tough choices that can hurt other people. It's just part of it. Plus, he gets a lot from being with a successful woman. You deserve the rewards of your success, he said. I understand, but I really doubt that Pat will agree to the kind of plan you're talking about, she replied. What can he do? He won't leave someone who supports him, he said. Laura laughed. You don't know Pat. Money isn't a big deal for him. He doesn't see things that way. Look, you're in control. If not tonight, when and where? He pressed. There was a long silence. Then she spoke so softly I barely caught her words. Wednesday at your place. I'll say I'm working late, but I need to be home by 11. Is that okay? Then I heard what sounded like a long kiss. All right, let's go, she said. Wednesday, he said firmly. They then got up and moved back to the main room. I stayed there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Had I just overheard my wife getting close with another man? Did she really set a date with him? Laura and I never had an equal relationship. I believe in every marriage there's often one person who takes charge. I don't mean that in a weird way. Laura was 6 years older than me. She had a job that paid more than 3 times what I earned and had plenty of opportunities to move up. The best I could hope for was a position that might pay me 3/4 of what she made. We never talked about it, but she was the one in charge of our home. She chose our house and drove the new BMW. The only time we truly felt like a couple was in private. I thought our intimacy was good for both of us. I couldn't picture it being better, but then she was the only one I had ever been with, and I knew that wasn't true for her. I never asked about her past, and she never shared. I had always assumed we were faithful. Now I realized that assumption might be wrong or about to change for Laura. I got out of the booth and walked back through the restaurant the same way I came. When I got to the main room, I spotted Laura easily. She was standing next to a tall, handsome man. He looked to be about 6'3", which was a good 2 inches taller than me. He seemed older, at least over 40, making him at least 15 years my senior. He had a slight belly, but it wasn't too noticeable, and his sharp suit covered it well. It was clear he was the kind of man who attracted women. Laura introduced me to Frank Patterson, the new head of the municipal finance group at her firm, where she worked most of the time. She looked so happy standing there with her boss. Frank gave me a smug smile that made it clear what he thought of me. We chatted about the trial I had just finished and my success. Laura was singing my praises as a trial lawyer, but Frank seemed unimpressed. I wanted to wipe that smile off his face. I knew I could take him down easily. He was weak. I thought about Leroy Johnson. What was the difference between us? Well, it was simple. Leroy was an honest carpenter. I was a tough ADA, and I would find a better way to handle my issues. Laura quickly pulled us apart and started to introduce me to her peers and superiors at the firm. These parties were more about office politics than having fun. Laura was hoping for a junior partnership, and that's why I was here. I realized that Frank's charm came partly from his position in the firm and what he could do for someone looking to become a junior partner. Eventually, we met Saul Solomon and his wife Martha. By then, I wasn't very interested in socializing. Laura didn't notice my mood change. Martha did, though, and asked if everything was okay. I assured her it was and put on my best smile. I didn't want her saying anything to her husband. The firm was mainly known as Brentwood and Stringer, but it actually had 7 names, one of which was Saul Solomon's. Saul, or Sal as his friends called him, was a lawyer, but I doubted he had practiced in years. He was probably the best lobbyist in the state capitol. He was a short, friendly man. His dark skin and Hispanic features contrasted with his clearly Jewish name and background. Martha was taller than him, a big woman in every way. She was just as friendly and outgoing as Saul. I had liked them both from the first time we met. Martha must have said something to Laura because Laura decided we should sit down and take a break. She led me to a table where her secretary, June, was with her husband, Willie, along with another secretary and her boyfriend. We made small talk for a bit, with the guys naturally chatting about sports. Laura soon excused herself to talk with some colleagues we hadn't seen yet. I used the chance to ask June for information about Laura's office and Frank Patterson in particular. Frank had come from the firm's Buffalo office the previous August, where he did commercial finance. He was a senior partner. I tried to keep my questions casual, not wanting to seem jealous or suspicious, but I sensed that June was also being careful about what she shared. We were avoiding the big issue that we both knew was happening between my wife and Frank Patterson. The evening thankfully ended early, and we drove home in my car because Laura had taken a cab to the party. "You're very quiet, my love," she said. When I didn't answer, she continued. "The trial bothered you, didn't it?" "I suppose so. The more I think about it, the more I see a man pushed to his limits trying to protect his home. Leroy Johnson was a good father and husband. He suffered an attack at home, but I ended up prosecuting him. He was the least guilty person in that room." "Wow, you really have a strong sense of right and wrong," she said, stopping to touch my arm and kiss my cheek. "In the legal world, things aren't clear-cut. Sometimes you have to make choices that feel uncomfortable, Don Quixote. It's all for the greater good," she added. "But I love you, my Boy Scout. Promise me you won't lose that kindness of yours. I'll get you out of the Van Patten mess as soon as I earn my partnership and start a family. Then you can focus on your legal battles. Trust me, I will take care of you," she said, resting her head on my shoulder. I didn't respond. We got home, and I kept quiet about what else was bothering me. The only difference between Leroy and me was that he had more courage. We were both tired and went to bed. I had trouble sleeping, but eventually I dozed off. I woke up Saturday morning feeling a warm sensation around me. With sleepy eyes, I saw my wife sitting on me. She had pulled the blankets off and raised her nightgown from the night before. "Good morning, sleepyhead." she said with a playful smile. "What's happening this morning?" I asked. She had done this before, but it was a long time since we had been this close. "Well, I have a wonderful husband who, even though tired from the trial, took me to a dull office party. He smiled and acted like the perfect husband, even trying his hand at small talk, which isn't his strong suit because he's shy. So he deserves some love this morning." After finishing her thought, she lifted her nightgown slightly, looking radiant. She took her time, moving gently as we enjoyed the moment. I reached up to touch her, holding her close. I kissed her softly, savoring the connection we had. She leaned into me, and I felt content to be lost in this peaceful morning together. While I fed the cat, I thought about our talk from the night before. Did I get it wrong? Was she just using this Patterson guy to get what she wanted without any real interest? I wanted to ask her, but I hesitated. We weren't usually a jealous couple. I had never doubted Laura's loyalty. So how could I bring it up without causing trouble? That night and into Sunday, she came to me again and again. I still tried to think of a way to ask what was really going on. Then Monday, she came home around 8, looking tired. We had a quiet evening together. Tuesday, I had night court in Tom Krill Town Court. It's a small rural town up in the northeast county. They mostly deal with traffic tickets. Once a month, they handle minor offenses like fights, small thefts, and checks that bounced. Things that could have been settled easily if the police hadn't gotten involved. It could be a busy night, or it could end quickly. That night was slow. When I got home around 10, Laura had dinner ready. She made sloppy joes from a mix, some frozen steak fries, and a salad. Nothing was from scratch, but this was our routine. Laura never cooked much, and our busy lives shaped how we lived. After dinner, we shared a slow, tender moment together, with me on top in a gentle embrace. After it was done, she cuddled close to me. "Laura, are we okay?" I asked, unsure how to word it. "Of course. I just needed you tonight. We are close to a big deal. Once I have that, we'll be set. By this time next year, I could be expecting a baby." As she spoke, she snuggled in tighter against me. "Do you really need to be a partner?" I asked. "Yes. The money will help us a lot. I've worked hard for it," she replied, turning to look at me. "Pat, are you jealous that it's me and not you?" "No, I'm just worried we might lose what we have over money." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not changing. I will always love you. It will always be us, just hopefully with a little more love." Sometimes during lonely, dark nights, I wish we had been more honest with each other. But then the morning comes, and I remind myself that what happened was meant to be. On Wednesday at 5 p.m., I sat in the back of the parking lot at 39 Corporate Woods. The building was a plain, rectangular box where Brentwood and Stringer used the second and most of the third floors. I was in an unmarked Ford sedan used by the DA's investigation team. It was easy to borrow it for the evening. I just made up an excuse about visiting a witness I had talked to over the phone earlier that morning. Laura had told me at breakfast that she would be working late and not to wait for her. She left with a sweet kiss and promised love. I borrowed the car because I didn't want Laura to see my own car. I waited outside her office and didn't have to wait long. Laura and Frank came out right after 5 and got into a shiny silver Mercedes. I followed closely behind. Frank drove fast. They went to Volpone, a nice but expensive restaurant just north of the Latham traffic circle. They arrived around 5:40 and I couldn't go in, so I waited in the car. Around 7:30 they came out. Frank gave Laura a quick kiss as he helped her into the car, then drove off slowly. I found that odd, but didn't have time to think about it because soon he turned into a driveway of a charming colonial house in Loudonville, the nicest area in Albany. He parked near the front door, which had an attached garage. They went inside, and lights turned on in the hall and a second-floor room. I waited on the street for about 45 minutes. I saw the light in the second-floor room dim, but I stayed another hour just to be sure. Finally, I gave up and went home. Once I arrived home, I took a shower and got ready for bed. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. My mind kept thinking about Laura being with someone else. I didn't cry, not because I think men shouldn't cry, but because I just don't cry. That doesn't mean I wasn't hurt. I felt sadness and loss like any man would in my situation. Before the night of the Leroy Johnson decision, I would have sworn that Laura loved me and would never cheat. I don't like to gamble because I'm not good at it, and Laura had shown me that it wasn't a smart thing to do. I thought about whether her actions came from a lack of love or respect, and I realized it was both. Right then, I felt too sorry for myself to decide what to do and pushed that decision aside until tomorrow. Laura came home around midnight. I pretended to be asleep. Our marriage was over, and I didn't think a confrontation was needed right then. While I lay there, Laura leaned down and kissed me gently on the forehead. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't show that I was awake. Thursday was a bright, cold winter day. I hardly slept and woke up earlier than usual. I wanted to avoid Laura, so I left before she was up. At work, I was called into Stan Condos's office, the district attorney. Stan had one goal in life: to become a judge. He was determined to run for one of the open judicial positions. In New York, judges of the lower state courts are elected. It's funny that the lower court is called the state Supreme Court, while the highest court is the Court of Appeals. So, in New York, cases start in the Supreme Court. Stan wanted to run for that. Unfortunately, he didn't have enough money to get the support he needed from the county political leaders. Even though judges are elected, they rarely have to campaign because a judicial convention is held where delegates from party leaders choose candidates to run without opposition. This process makes money for the party leaders since the positions are sold, though it's done in secret. The only rule is that the bar committee has to review and approve the candidates to keep things looking fair. My old coach had complicated things. As Laura had expected, he ran for governor and won by a lot. Governor Kincaid pushed through a judicial reform bill. He couldn't change judges from elected to appointed, but he did make the districts more fair and required a special election for more judges before a judicial convention could happen. Then, the state bar president stepped up with a special screening committee. Stan Condos was the district attorney, known for being strict but fair. He had a good chance of winning the next election if he could gather about $100,000 for his campaign. With that money, he could expect the big law firms to support him, giving him even more. He must have felt pleased about my win last Friday because it looked good for the women's groups and those who cared about law and order. Stan's secretary welcomed me and showed me to a chair. He wasn't in the office yet, but he soon walked in and gave me a friendly pat on the back. "Great job, Pat. I always know I can count on you." He needed to rely on me. In a busy office that handled important cases, I was the only real trial lawyer he had. The chief assistant, Dexter Ealing, was the only one who earned a decent salary, but he struggled in court. Still, he was good at managing the office. I had no issues with Dexter. He did his job well and was fair, but he didn't like me. I wasn't sure why. Some people just don't click. But I thought maybe it was because he felt a bit jealous of my success in court, especially compared to his own experiences. Besides Dexter, the other full-time lawyer was Sheila Nealer. She came from a well-known family and mostly helped Stan with whatever he needed, acting more like his assistant than a lawyer. There were whispers about them, but rumors are common. In my view, her plain looks didn't suggest a romantic link between them. She might have liked him, but I doubted he felt the same. The rest of the staff were part-timers who were content to stay that way. We had 3 part-time lawyers who spent most of their time in their own offices, helping cover different courts. That left me and Stan to handle the major trials. Stan only showed up for the easy wins or when it was time to celebrate. "Pat, I've decided to run for judge." "Good for you. Congratulations, Your Honor." Stan chuckled at that. "Maybe it's a bit early for that, which is why I wanted to talk to you. I'm resigning soon to focus on my campaign. I know I don't have to, but to raise the money, I'll need to work on my connections. With the way things are right now, I'd hate to get into trouble." That made sense. If Stan used the favors he had earned while still in office, he could be accused of selling his position. Leaving would mean that the campaign donations would be seen as hopeful support. But he would still need a way to influence his DA office. His next words revealed his plan. "I'm going to suggest Dexter take over for now. He knows how everything works, and he can reach out to me if he needs help," Stan said. That sounded reasonable. Dexter Elling would be the person to remember the special favors that had been done. Stan hesitated, as if he didn't want to continue. At that moment, I sensed that bad news was coming. "We are promoting Sheila Nealer to chief assistant," he said. If Dexter was almost useless in court, Sheila was downright ineffective. She was one of those lawyers who passed law school by memorizing everything and could only repeat it when asked. They take the bar exam over and over until, by chance, they finally succeed. Promoting Sheila had only one benefit. Her grandfather was a state assemblyman, and her father was the county executive. Stan was looking at me, waiting for my reaction, but I had no strong feelings. I never expected to get the job anyway, even though I was qualified. What really mattered were Stan's next words, which would change everything for us. "That leaves a full-time position open. I'm going to hire Mary Ellen Seaman," he said, which made me sit up straight. She was fresh out of law school. I had interviewed her for the part-time job she held and didn't recommend her when I realized she didn't have the right attitude for court. She was very young, about 5 feet tall, with short brown hair. She looked around 17 and acted similarly. In a courtroom, even the worst defense lawyer could easily take advantage of her, and they often did. We had her working the easiest courts at night and still faced issues. "Come on, Stan. That will leave just me to handle cases," I said. "Not really. There's still Mark and Tony." Mark Steele, part of the firm Steele & Steele with his dad, was a good lawyer, but he only worked part-time for the health insurance. Tony Lorenzo was smooth and could handle trials, but he didn't like to do them often. Neither of them wanted to take on more work than necessary. "What you're suggesting is likely to double my workload. What's in it for me?" Stan made a serious face before answering. "Honestly, I can't offer you anything right now. Maybe in a year or two things will change if Dexter wins the election in November. I know Dex and I would really appreciate it," he said. I could see the concern on his face. I could quit, which would leave everyone in a difficult position. A few days ago, I might have done that, but things had changed. My wife had let me down, and I needed this job. All I could do was accept it for now, but inside, something shifted. I'd always tried to do the right thing, yet here I was, feeling betrayed by my wife and stuck in a job that felt like a dead end. It was time to reconsider my options. Strangely, I felt a bit of relief. I smiled and said, "Anything else, boss?" Stan gave me a strange, doubtful look. "No, that's it." "Sorry, Pat, but I had to make some choices." I thought about how those choices only benefited her. That's just how the world is sometimes. In my office, I closed the door and settled into my big, old leather office chair. It was the only nice thing I had, a chair that belonged to the man I replaced. Tommy Maitland had suddenly passed away one day in court. He was gone in 10 minutes. He was a good guy. Divorced after his wife decided she didn't want to be with him anymore, he had 3 kids. A year after his death, his wife remarried, clearly looking for something better. She moved on, and Tommy was gone at just 46. There was a knock on the door, and without waiting, someone came in. Katrina Gomez walked in. She was a nice young woman, short, with long black hair and dark brown eyes. Her skin was a lovely shade of light, showing off her Irish heritage. I guessed she got her other features from her Puerto Rican father. She had just joined our office staff and always seemed cheerful, wanting to spread happiness to others. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Sullivan. I'm collecting for Bee's retirement gift," she said. Beatrice Thuman was retiring at the end of the year, and Katrina, being the newest member, was in charge of collecting. "How much do you need?" I asked, curious. With a bit of shyness, she replied, "We're asking the lawyers for $10 each and the rest of the staff for $5. But honestly, $5 would be great if you can help." I knew she must have faced some pushback from others, especially from the soon-to-be interim DA, Dexter Ealing. I reached into my wallet and handed her a 20. "Do you want change? 10 or 15? I offered. "Keep it. It'll help with the others," I replied. "Oh, thank you," she smiled at me. Then she noticed the dim light in my office and I guess my gloomy mood. "Is something wrong, Mr. Sullivan?" "No, nothing's wrong. I have a great job and a great life," I said with a crooked smile, trying to lighten the mood. "All right, then. If there's anything I can do, just let me know, and thanks for your generous gift. I know Bee will appreciate it." She left, closing the door behind her, but it didn't quite latch. As I got up to close it, I heard voices in the hallway. Katrina must have run into Marge Zuckerman, our office manager. "Why does Pat seem so sad?" Katrina asked Marge. "Oh, nothing much, just being overlooked and expected to do everything on his own. The higher-ups really messed him over this time," Marge replied. I didn't catch the rest of their conversation as they walked away, but it was enough to know that everyone had noticed my mood. I felt even angrier, knowing that I looked weak because, truthfully, I was feeling weak. I couldn't stand up for myself at work or at home. Another man was with my wife, and I felt powerless to stop it. I shut the door tightly and was about to sit there, feeling angry and helpless, when my phone rang. "Sergeant Brandt from the sheriff's office is here to see you," Sally, the secretary I shared with my co-workers, said. I didn't want to see Sergeant Brandt at that moment. He was the father of Mary Lou Brandt, who had been arrested for having drugs. She had been in a car with 4 other young people, including a guy who had been arrested for drugs before. It was clear they had all been using drugs, but Mary Lou ended up getting in trouble for it. Sergeant Brandt was respected and had a good reputation. He wouldn't usually ask for help, but as a father, he would probably do anything to save his daughter. Unfortunately, I had no real way to help him. With someone else looking to become judge, there was little chance for mercy for the daughter of a police officer. When Sergeant Brandt walked in, I noticed he had a strong build. He was tall and heavy-set, much like a classic movie hero. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, shaking my hand firmly but kindly, "I'm glad to meet you, though I wish it were under better conditions. You are well known as a prosecutor." "I wish we were meeting in better conditions too," I replied. We spent the next hour talking, but it didn't lead anywhere. He explained that his daughter was a good girl who had just made a mistake. She was a top student in college and wanted to be a teacher. She was smart, but not great at choosing friends. She was shy and kind of nerdy, which made her more easily influenced. The photo in the file showed her as a decent-looking girl who seemed younger than 19, her actual age. "I'll do anything to help my daughter. Please, tell me what to do, Mr. Sullivan." This man, who had devoted nearly 30 years to the sheriff's office, called me Mr. and lowered himself to seek my help for his beloved daughter. I felt a strong desire to assist him and to find a way to get back at the judge candidate. But at that moment, I saw no path forward. "The best I can suggest is to get Mary Lou into a treatment program. She may not need it, but it can only help and show that she's trying." Then, before I realized it, an instinct inside me was growing. There was a nagging thought that I could barely picture, but it was starting to take shape in my mind. "I'll call you if there's anything else we can do. I promise to help her find a way out," I said. "Thank you," he replied, standing up and taking my hands in his. I thought I saw tears beginning to form in his eyes. I walked him to the door. As I turned back, I looked around the office. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just going to sit back and let things happen. It was time to act, especially while it seemed I was powerless. I spent the rest of the day trying to understand what I instinctively knew but couldn't articulate. I kept thinking about Frank Patterson. Wealthy, arrogant, and ultimately weak inside. I could tell just by looking at him. I just needed the right angle, and he'd crumble easily. The waitress approached me. She was a short, pretty brunette wearing a black skirt that was a bit too short for my taste and a white blouse that reminded me of a man's dress shirt. She had a green name tag that read Trina. She seemed familiar. It took me a moment to remember. She was one of the witnesses in the Roger Hamilton murder trial. Hamilton was accused of killing his pregnant wife out of jealousy. It had been a big trial, getting a lot of attention from the media. The problem was that the case against Hamilton looked very solid. The Albany County District Attorney's Office was already celebrating before the trial even started. Hamilton had to find a lawyer desperate enough to take his case. He found one in Stephen Fitzpatrick, my best friend. Stephen and I grew up together in a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Cobble Hill. There's no hill there. George Washington used it as a spot for cannons during the American Revolution. After the British took over, they leveled the hill, so now it's just flat land south of Brooklyn Heights. We went to the same Catholic school and later attended Brooklyn Law School, which was close by. We were a great team in mock trials. I couldn't help but go watch Stephen during the Hamilton trial in Albany County. If I had been the one prosecuting, Stephen wouldn't have gotten away with the tricks he played, and Hamilton, who was definitely guilty, would have been found guilty. "Hello, Laurie," I said when I recognized her. The friendly smile on her face faded a bit as she studied me. She didn't seem to recognize me. "I was in the audience during the Hamilton trial," I added. She frowned slightly at my words. I smiled and said, "Stephen Fitzpatrick is an old friend." This made her smile back. "He's a great guy," she replied. "Yes," I agreed. "What will you have to drink?" "I'll have the brown ale," I said. She nodded and went to get my drink. Watching her leave made me feel a bit happier. She was a mother of 3 kids from 2 different fathers. She only got support from one father and worked 3 jobs to take care of her family. I could see how Steve had gotten close to her. When she returned with the beer, I gave her a $20 bill and told her to keep the change. I was at Brown's, a local pub in Troy that had opened a fancy whiskey bar, too. I had been following Frank Patterson for about 2 weeks. I watched him have dinner and spend time with my wife, but I was also just trying to learn about him. It was Thursday night, and he was back at Brown's. I followed him inside. He sat at a table with 7 other men, all dressed in nice clothes. They looked like some kind of club or networking group. They were laughing and having a good time together. Around 8:30, Lori came back to see if I wanted another drink. Frank and his friends were still joking around and drinking. They had finished their second round while I was still sipping my first beer. "You find them interesting?" she asked, looking at the table. "Just one of them," I said. "Mr. Handsy and cheap," she remarked. "What do you mean?" I asked. She nodded towards Frank and said, "He's always touching if a girl isn't paying attention, but he's the worst tipper of the bunch." "Let me make it up to you," I said, handing her a 50 and ordering another beer. For the next 6 weeks, except for the week of Christmas, I made it a habit to come to Brown's every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Most nights I just had a beer and left a big tip. Lori and I became good friends. She would be ready for me when I arrived. Frank never missed a night with the guys, who turned out to be bankers, insurance agents, and lawyers. They seemed like a club or network for professional men, just a group of guys helping each other out. I watched Frank drive home to Loudonville after his nights with the guys. He always drove carefully and stayed within the speed limit. Many people think 1 or 2 drinks will put you over the limit for driving, but a big guy like Frank needed more than that. His careful driving had a purpose, and I was eager to find out what it was. December 30th was Bee's last working day. She had completed 30 years with the county, the last 16 at the DA's office. The farewell party would start at 2 p.m. Chuck Spencer, the junior investigator, drew the short straw. He would stay at the office while the rest of the team went to a party at Daisy Baker's, a popular bar in Troy located in an old reading room. I was supposed to be at the party, but at the last minute I got held up by a call from the state police. I had set up that call in advance to give me an excuse. About an hour after the staff left, I let Chuck go and told him to keep quiet about my plan. I would take care of things since I was already here. Once I was sure he had left, I locked up the office but kept the lights on. Bee's desk was empty, but her computer was still on. The IT team wouldn't take her access away until the next day. I searched her desk and found her password on a sticky note under the middle drawer. I logged in as her and went to the state's criminal database. If anyone checked, they would only see Bee's name, as it was her last day. They would have to look her up at her retirement home in Florida to know it wasn't her. When I searched for Frank Patterson, I got about 20 results. It took me half an hour to find the right Frank Patterson. I couldn't help but smile as I read through his record. 4 years ago, he was arrested for DUI, but it got reduced to reckless driving with a fine. Then, a year and a half later, he had another DWI reduced to a DUI, a misdemeanor, which meant he got a suspended sentence. He lost his driver's license for 6 months but got lucky. That gave him 2 strikes, since the first offense counted as alcohol-related, even though it was reduced. I had him now. I just needed a way to catch him. 3 strikes would mean a felony. "Sarge Brandt, please come in," I said, calling him to talk about his daughter's case. He looked serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Did you follow my advice and get your daughter into a treatment program?" I asked. He nodded. "That's good. Now I have some questions for you." "Anything you want," he said. "You told me you would do anything to help your daughter. Did you really mean it?" He sat up, looking a bit nervous, but after a moment he answered firmly, "Yes." "Good. Do you still work road patrol sometimes?" "Yes, sometimes I fill in for others who need time off." "Okay. Do you know that stretch of road in Van Patten County between Rensselaer and Albany near the Green Island Bridge?" "Yes. It's about 2/10 of a mile along the highway. Let's say a silver Mercedes was driving by with a broken tail light, and you were on duty that night, about a week from this Thursday. If you pulled over that car and smelled alcohol on the driver, what would you do? an arrest might happen, I thought. At least they should do a sobriety test, he said, looking both puzzled and interested. Yes, definitely a test, especially since the person involved could be a well-known lawyer and everything should be done properly. I'm not sure I fully understand, he said. I picked up his daughter's file. Your daughter's case looks pretty straightforward, so there's no reason to give her special treatment. But a lot can happen in an office like this. Files can disappear, and if someone mishandles things and puts everything into one case file that gets lost, well, that case can just vanish. It could be dismissed, erased from the records. I can easily see this file going missing next week. Brandt stared at me. I could see hope and a slow understanding in his eyes. He knew I was asking him to do something wrong but legally acceptable. If anything went wrong, the blame would be on me. Even if I got caught, he would be safe, just doing his job. The driver would either pass the sobriety test or fail. Just a test, or are we talking about an arrest? He asked. A test that's likely to fail, followed by an arrest. But don't worry, when it goes to court, the best defense attorney will be there to help, and the worst assistant district attorney will be on the other side. That's just the way it goes. Sergeant Brandt nodded. I know I'll be on patrol that Thursday, probably with a very reliable partner. But what time, if you have a rough idea? Oh, I'd say between 9:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. would work just fine. After that, we shook hands, and he went on his way. The last part was the hardest for me. I really didn't want to ask, but I felt I had no other choice. Stephen Fitzpatrick was my best friend. For our meeting, Stephen chose the legislators' dining area in the Empire State Plaza in Albany, just outside the Justice Building. It was a strange choice until you realized it was quiet and perfect for private talks. Stephen knew instinctively that I needed this to be confidential. How have you been, Pat? He asked. Good, Steve. How about you? Doing as well as I can, he replied. It was an unusual situation. Stephen and I were closer than brothers, yet we were very different. His wife, Susan, was a lot like Laura. Susan was 32, while he was 27. She was very successful and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She had a stunning appearance and a magnetic charm. However, she was also known for her affairs with taller and stronger men than Stephen. Stephen was short, about 5'7", and slim, enough to seem delicate, but I knew he was strong and had the endurance of an athlete. He was also incredibly smart and handsome. Plus, he had an uncanny ability to sense things around him. She promised that everything would be great. She really didn't know how right she was. What can I do for you, Pat? He asked with a smug smile, likely remembering Monday. I had waited until most of his friends had left. Laurie was very friendly that night and careless too, often leaning close to Frank. He had quite a few drinks, but the last one was a strong triple. When I sat down, Laurie brought me a single drink and Frank a triple. I need to talk to you privately, I said loud enough for his friends to hear. They were nice and said their goodbyes, leaving me alone with Frank. What do you want? He asked. I need your help since you've been seeing my wife. I want to keep things from getting messy. This surprised him, but being who he is, he tried to deny it. I think you're mistaken, he said. I had to pull out my phone and show him the times and places they had been together, along with pictures of them together. This shocked him. He knew he was caught. What do you need? He finally asked. Not much, just a divorce, a simple way to end the marriage. Knowing Laura, she won't give in easily unless you help. Can you convince her to just go away? I asked. Frank took a long drink and gave me a smug smile. I think we should keep things quiet. But remember, this is a no-fault state. You don't need a reason to divorce. True, but you have a big law firm. You could make things hard for me, and Laura can be very stubborn. She'll need convincing. So we sat for a while, having drinks, while the friendly Laurie kept our glasses full. We discussed how to handle my wife and Frank's partner. Just before 10 p.m., we wrapped up our talk, with Frank looking confident as he left. I followed him out to the parking lot. When he got to his car, he hesitated, fumbling with his keys. For a second, I thought he might call a cab, but he got into his Mercedes and drove off slowly. With a broken taillight, he was heading straight into trouble. I waited a good half hour before I followed him. When I crossed the bridge, I saw the police lights. They had him out of the car and were putting handcuffs on him. I drove right past. I stopped at the Latham Diner not far from the traffic circle. It was 10:40. My phone rang, It was Laura, probably wondering where I was. I let it go to voicemail. I ordered a burger, fries, and coffee. Laura called every 20 minutes. She sounded worried but was not overreacting yet. She probably expected me home much earlier. I needed to be clear-headed for what was coming next. After leaving the diner around midnight, filled with food and coffee, I got home before 12:30. Laura was sitting on the couch, looking upset in our simple ranch house. This was the place she had chosen, hoping to start our family. "Where have you been? You could have at least called or answered my calls," she said. I took a seat in the chair facing her and replied, "I didn't call because it's too late for that now." "What?" She looked confused. I wasn't acting sorry like she expected. Just then, her phone started to ring. "You should answer that," I said. "It can wait. I need to know what is going on with you. You've been acting weird for weeks. Just tell me, Pat. What's happening?" "If you answer your phone, you'll find out," I said. Reluctantly, she got up to grab her phone. I could only hear her side of the conversation, but could guess what the other person was saying. "Frank, I can't talk right now. I'll see you tomorrow." "What? That's not possible." Her eyes got big as she looked at me. "Never. He would never do that, even if he knew." Then her head dropped. "I understand. Let me talk to him. I'll call you back." She hung up and walked back to stand in front of me. "Frank says you know about us and that you set him up. Do I know that you've been unfaithful? Yes, I do. As for setting him up, I didn't make him drink. I guess he just got unlucky." Laura seemed to sink down onto the couch. "I'm sorry. I really wanted to fix things for us." "I don't care about your excuses. It's too late for that. Pat, please don't go down this path. We can fix things. You'll see it didn't mean anything to me." "Oh, but you're very wrong. It means everything." "What exactly did Frank say?" "He said he will pay the $200,000. "Good. That's his part. Glad to hear it." "No, you can't do that. You need to calm down. This is crazy." I couldn't help but laugh at her. "What? You didn't think you were worth that much? Don't sell yourself short. You are worth a lot." She didn't like what I said, but she kept her voice calm and held her emotions together. She was a good lawyer under pressure. "Please don't do this. I know you will regret it," she said, trying to turn the blame back to me. "Sorry, but it's too late. Now it's your turn." "My turn?" "Yes. Frank is in a tough spot and doesn't have many options because of his past mistakes. He could lose his law license for a long time. So if you want this to go smoothly, you'll have to agree to my terms." I handed her the property settlement agreement I had worked on all week. As she read the letter, I saw her eyes widen in shock. "Do you really dislike me this much?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. She could only shake her head. The agreement was quite clear. I received everything: the house, her retirement funds, and our savings. She got her BMW, $5,000 in cash, and the clothes she was wearing. I even took the wedding rings. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at me. I had finally broken through her walls. I had come out on top, but it didn't feel like a win. I had a strange feeling that I lost something important, but I pushed that thought away. "Why are you doing this? I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to ruin the man I love. You will never recover from this. I'm not asking for myself. I love you. Please don't harm yourself because of my mistakes. Just stop, Pat, before it's too late." "It was too late the first time you were unfaithful," I said. I stood up and left because I just couldn't take it anymore. Stan Kronkos was sitting behind his desk when I walked in without knocking. He looked up, frowning, and asked, "What do you want?" I smiled and took a seat in front of him. "Last night, a well-known lawyer was arrested for drinking too much. He blew a 2 on the breath test, which isn't surprising given how much he drank." "So?" "Well, Mary Ellen handled his arraignment but forget to get a blood test. She also didn't get a statement from the arresting officer, Sergeant Brandt. He probably has a bad memory today since someone seems to have erased the record of his daughter's drug arrest." "What the hell?" "Exactly. Or to put it another way, that's $100,000 in campaign donations from a source we can't trace. All you have to do is step aside quietly to run for judge without naming a successor. And if anyone asks, I'm a very strong candidate, an excellent choice." "You're out of your mind. This will never happen." "As I said, it's $100,000 from a source that can't be found." Stan sat there for a moment, his mouth open in disbelief. Then he closed it and nodded slowly. I stood to leave, and as I reached the door, he said, You're the last person I expected to pull something like this. Well, you never know, I replied. Later that day, I met with Tommy LaCour, the county party chairman at Malloy's restaurant, a place where many political deals are made. Mr. Sullivan, what can I help you with? He asked. You can ask the governor to make me acting DA when Stan resigns to run for judge. Why would I do that? He questioned. I can think of 100,000 reasons, all green with dollar signs. That's a lot of money to handle, he said. The term walking around money comes from the cash given to campaign workers on election day for various small expenses. But it also talks about the extra money that the county party chairman has. It's money he can use however he wants, with no rules attached. Let's just say I have it, and I'll make sure it gets to you through someone reliable as soon as the governor picks me, he said. Tommy thought for a moment and then reached across the table. I hope you're at least a Democrat, Mr. Sullivan, he asked. Just call me Pat. I'm changing my party today, he replied. We both laughed. New York is the biggest city in the United States. It is also one of the world's important cities and is home to the United Nations. Yet, for reasons lost in early American history, New York City is not the capital of New York State. The state capital is in Albany, a city located north along the Hudson River. Even if we take Albany's population away from New York City's, there are still over 8 million people left in the city. Most of the real state government work happens in New York City, often just called the city. When people say Albany, they could mean the city or the state government, depending on the context. New York's governors don't usually spend much time in Albany. The governor's house is not very cozy or private. Albany sits in a snowy area that is one of the coldest parts of North America, east of the Rocky Mountains. It's not the coldest place in the state, but it does have long, snowy winters and often snowy springs. Because of this, New York governors try to spend as little time there as they can. Governor Edward Kincaid is no different. He likes his warm apartment with views of Central Park in the city more than the chilly weather in Albany. However, in March, everyone in the New York state government knows the governor must go up the Hudson River to Albany and pretend that the state legislature is busy working on the state budget. Usually, the budget, which is due by April 1st, gets passed in late June, just in time for the July 4th break and the start of election season. So, on the first Monday in March, Edward Kincaid was in Albany. The main office in the Capitol building is called the Red Room, and it's only used for official events. The governor does most of his work in a smaller room behind his main office. Okay, Tony, who's next? Governor Kincaid asked his top aide, Tony Greco. Tony was someone who took pride in knowing many people and their plans. Tom LaCour, our chairman for Van Patten County. He must be looking for money because they don't have much control there, Tony replied. The Republicans have the assembly member, the state senator, the county leader, and the county council. So Tom is looking for money for the next election? Most likely, but I don't see how we can spare it, Tony replied. Kincaid thought for a moment and then said, What if I offer to go to a few fundraising events for him? That should help and only take some of my time. I'm stuck here anyway. The two men agreed. Then the governor's trusty assistant, Mrs. Betty Morgan, brought the Democratic chairman of the most Republican county in the state to meet the state's Democratic governor. After chatting a bit about Tommy's daughter's recent acceptance into medical school and his son's final year at Doane Stewart, a private school known for its great academics and poor sports, they got to the main topic. Well, Tom, what can I do for you? The governor asked. Have you heard that Stan Condos plans to step down as DA to run for judge? Tom said. This bit of news surprised the governor, but Tony quickly added that they had heard Stan was thinking about that. We believe it's pretty much decided, and I would like to share our party's choice for the interim appointment, Tom said, speaking faster than he meant to because he was a little nervous. I'm always happy to hear from those who represent the community. You are in a better position to know local needs than I am, the governor replied kindly. His words didn't mean exactly what they sounded like. What he really meant was that he had no one in mind, and Tom should share his choice. Well, we think the best candidate is someone who knows that office well, Tom began, finally feeling calmer. I wouldn't want it any other way, the governor said, now curious about who the Democrat is in a Republican DA's office. We're suggesting Patrick Sullivan. He is a smart young man and an excellent. Tony was about to jump in, but the governor's firm hand on his knee warned him to stay quiet. At the same time, the governor cut Tom off. "You don't need to tell me about Pat Sullivan. I know him very well. He could be a great district attorney in a few years when he has more experience," the governor said. "Right now, he is the chief trial lawyer there, and from what we see in the office, as you mentioned, he is the best trial lawyer they have," Tom said. He paused for a moment and then spoke words that surprised the governor and his assistant. "Van Patten County thinks this appointment is very important," Tom said, looking the governor in the eye. Edward Kincaid didn't see himself as a great politician. It was a job he had sort of fallen into. But at that moment he showed no signs of uncertainty. His clever advisor, Tony Greco, looked shocked, but Kincaid gave no hint of his surprise. Tom's words were a kind of code that meant if the governor didn't agree to appoint Sullivan, he couldn't expect support from Van Patten County in the next election. To hear this from the weakest county leader in the state was surprising. Kincaid showed no anger or confusion, even though he felt both. He knew Patrick Sullivan well. He had taught him, and he believed no one was better in the courtroom with one exception. The governor realized he needed to learn more before making any decisions. Appointments could come back to cause problems. Kincaid wasn't going to make a hasty choice or lose a vote by being careful. "I will consider your view and let you know my decision soon," the governor said. His words were clear to those who understood the context. He promised to think about it. Tom LaCour could ask for nothing more. "Thank you, Governor," Tom said as the meeting ended. After Tom left, Tony Greco said, "I'll look into this Sullivan guy right away." "No, Tony, stay out of this," Kincaid replied. "Why not?" "Pat Sullivan is good friends with Stephen Fitzgerald." Mentioning that name made Tony sit up straight. He had been involved with Susan Singleton, who was Stephen Fitzgerald's wife, for over a year. The governor knew about the affair. It wasn't a secret. The Singletons were connected to the DeVoe family. Their mother was Catherine DeVoe, and their father was Joseph Singleton, an insurance mogul. The DeVoe Singleton sisters were famous for their beauty and their wild reputation. Both were often listed among the most beautiful women in the world, and both had married quieter, bookish men. Neither Susan nor Mary Singleton had ever, as the governor knew, let a wedding ring stop them from having a good connection. Edward Kincaid had never fully trusted Stephen Fitzgerald. He showed great skill in court, but something about Stephen gave him a bad feeling. "Stay away, Tony. We don't need any trouble," the governor warned. Tony nodded. He felt trapped in his love for a woman who enjoyed being with him, but would not consider leaving her husband, a man Tony believed was not worthy of her. 2 hours later, Don Pleasant, a retired police chief from NYC, was meeting with the governor. The governor had security from the state police, but he personally hired some extra protection from his own money. Don was in charge of that security. "I need you to find out more about Patrick Sullivan. I think his wife works at the law firm Brentwood and Stringer. He is involved with the district attorney's office in Van Patten County. The local Democrats suddenly want to promote him. Find out why and anything else you can learn. Also, check on Stephen Fitzgerald's situation. Keep this quiet. We don't want anyone to know we are looking at Stephen." "When do you need this, Governor?" Don asked. "Yesterday, but be careful. I have a feeling something isn't right." After Don left, Ed Kincaid, the governor of New York, pressed his fingers together and sat back in his large desk chair, reflecting on how much had changed since he trained those two talented young men in trial skills. Were they now his friends or his foes? Laura, at least she wasn't crying anymore. For the past 2 weeks, that had been all she could do. But today was different. The tears had stopped. It wasn't because things were better. It started off badly. Frank Patterson had scolded her in front of the municipal bond team over small mistakes in the Corinth bond prospectus. They were just typos after all. It was still a draft. Technically, the prospectus was her responsibility, but Frank's anger really came from another reason. Everyone knew it had to do with Patrick Sullivan, Laura's husband, who might soon be her ex-husband if he got his way. You see, Frank and Laura had what they considered a quiet affair. Most of the office knew there was something going on, but they didn't think it crossed the line. In public, they acted friendly and professional. A little flirting stayed within acceptable limits. The truth was, their relationship had quite a spark. There was only one small issue, more of an awkward embarrassment than a serious problem. She was married. Her husband was a quiet and shy man who was over 5 years younger than her. He was a wonderful partner. Patrick Sullivan was kind, caring, and loving. Everyone could see that he would do anything for his wife, Laura. He put his own career aside to help her succeed, and she became very successful, earning about 4 times what he did. Even if you took Patrick's salary away from Laura's, she would still make more than $150,000. Patrick was the perfect husband for a woman with big career dreams. He understood that her job was more important, and he supported her goals. In this way, Patrick was very different from Frank Patterson. Frank was an alpha male. He was strong, confident, and knew just what to say. Patrick was different. He was more of a beta male, but he had a caring spirit that Laura admired. Even after 5 years of marriage, there were still parts of Patrick's quiet personality that Laura didn't fully understand. These differences were starting to bother her. Laura met Patrick while she was interviewing candidates for her law firm, Brentwood and Stringer. It was the second largest firm in the state. Patrick was unlikely to be chosen as a summer law clerk since only the very best were interviewed by the senior associates who made the real decisions. Laura was new to the firm, just starting her second year. She had taken and passed the bar exam the year before, and she had worked very hard during her first year, often putting in 80 to 100 hours a week. Now she was a full but junior associate and earned $210 an hour for her work. She had come to Brooklyn Law to improve her interviewing skills, and she picked the candidates based on their school records and experience. Laura was only interviewing the top students and law review members, with one exception. Patrick Sullivan's resume showed he was in the middle of his class and had no law review experience, but he participated in mock trial with Edward Kincaid. Kincaid gave him a personal recommendation, and many people believed he would be the next governor. Laura admired Kincaid. It wasn't a Hollywood crush, but instead a professional admiration that made her curious. Since Kincaid also taught at Brooklyn and was busy with his political journey, Laura thought she could ask Patrick about him during the interview. It was the last interview of the day when a young man with a striking resemblance to a famous actor walked in. Patrick Sullivan looked very Irish. He was tall, and his light hair had a hint of red in it. But mostly she noticed his deep, warm, sea-blue eyes. She didn't usually pay attention to a person's eyes right away, but his were captivating. She was surprised to find out how shy he was. He was also younger than most law students. He stumbled a bit during the interview, and she wondered how he would do on the mock trial team. Yet she couldn't deny that she felt drawn to him, enough to suggest they grabbed drinks after the interview. Capulet's on Montauk Street was a typical bar for young people in Brooklyn, not a place you'd expect a trendy New Yorker to be. It wasn't very expensive, but the prices felt a little too high. The place had no real style, with Shakespeare quotes stuck to the tables. The drinks were large, and the food looked too heavy for anyone over their teenage years to eat. They shared a pitcher of sangria, which was surprisingly good, though she soon realized it packed a punch. As they drank, his accent became clearer. It wasn't quite Irish, nor was it a Brooklyn accent she recognized, but it felt familiar. Sometimes she thought she heard a hint of Dutch, but maybe it was just her imagination. His voice was sweet and had a ringing quality like a bell. It was clear he didn't realize this unique quality he had. Just as she was about to ask about it, his friends arrived. One woman stood out. She was strikingly beautiful. Tall, maybe 5'10", she had an elegant shape and curves that made her look like a model in a magazine. Her big brown eyes and jet black hair were stunning. Her skin was fair with a light tan. Laura couldn't remember ever seeing someone so captivating in person. The woman wore tight black leather pants and a simple white blouse. She wore just the right amount of makeup and clearly knew how to turn heads when she walked in. The man with her, though, was easy to miss. He was shorter, about 5'7", and looked even smaller with her wearing 4-inch heels. Stephen Fitzgerald was someone you could easily overlook, but once you noticed him, it was hard to look away. He was strikingly handsome, like a young Peter O'Toole. Like Patrick, he was shy, but his light blue eyes locked onto Laura's, holding her gaze like it was meant to be, the second time that happened to her that day. This was how she first met Stephen, nicknamed Foxy, and Susan DeVoe Singleton. When Laura heard Susan's full name, it clicked that she was the youngest daughter of Joseph Singleton and Catherine DeVoe. The DeVoes were wealthy, with Joe Singleton working in insurance. Brentwood and Stringer had worked with DeVoe Singleton, the third largest reinsurer in the country and the largest that's privately owned. Susan turned out to be one of those people whose personality was both surprising and delightful. Laura was a real people person. She loved being around others, and soon she found herself captivated by them. They talked a lot and discovered they had much in common, especially their strong drive to succeed. The two guys at the table quietly sipped their wine. They didn't say much, but seemed to understand each other well. When they did speak, it was clear they both shared the same accent, and they seemed quite shy. Susan, a friend of Laura's, spoke for them. She explained that they grew up just a few blocks away in Cobble Hill. Back then, it wasn't a trendy place. It was a middle-class area caught between rich and poor, Susan said. The two boys were very close, almost like brothers. They had gone to the same elementary school, high school, and even Fordham University. Now they were both in their second year at Brooklyn Law School. Susan mentioned that she had met Stephen at a popular bar in Manhattan during a blind date, but it didn't go well. "I saw my chance and took it," she said, smiling as she held Stephen's hand. When Susan went to the restroom, she asked Laura to come along. After they finished, Susan took a moment to fix her hair and makeup. "So, what do you think of Patrick?" she asked. "Well, I guess he's kind of different," Laura replied. "Yeah, he's a virgin like Stephen," Susan said. "Really? They seem a bit innocent, but—" Laura asked, surprised. "Yep. I've been dating Stephen since the summer, but I can't bring myself to take that next step with him. He's so sweet, and I really like him. I might have to be the one to propose or trick him into thinking he did." They both laughed, even though it wasn't entirely funny. Laura found it tough to connect with Patrick. She wrote her phone number on the back of her business card and made sure he took it when they said goodbye. She already had his number and address from his resume, but she wanted him to reach out first. 3 days went by without a call. Then Susan called, inviting her out the next weekend. "Will Pat be there? He hasn't called me," Laura asked, feeling a bit worried. Susan just laughed. "Don't stress. He's really into you. He's just nervous. I'll get Stephen to encourage him." The next day, Patrick finally called, and they made plans for a double date that Saturday. This continued for a few weeks until Laura realized that treating Patrick like other guys wasn't working. She needed to take the lead. He would follow her cue. It was a style of relationship that suited her. She had just ended a casual fling with a man from her firm. It was the usual thing for her, nothing serious. They'd been intimate after a few dates, but she ended it when he started to act like he owned her. Laura had always found love to be a short story that kept repeating. After 3 to 6 months, it usually ended. Either the guys became too clingy, or they left her for someone else. This pattern started back in high school. She was the smartest student and the top of her class, but boys never liked her for her brains. They liked her for her looks, which she understood clearly. Back then, the boys rarely hid their interest. Now Laura was busy working long hours at a law firm. Most men didn't want a relationship where they took a back seat to her job. She could date someone who would see her as a way to get ahead in life, but she didn't want that. She could have many casual relationships, but what she truly longed for was a man who would care for her and love her. She dreamed of a kind man who would want to marry her, but right now, he was just a figure in her imagination, and she was starting to think he might never appear. On her dates with Pat, her friends Stephen and Susan came along at first. This helped with the conversation. Susan talked a lot, but it made the evenings enjoyable and easygoing. However, everything changed on their third date, the time she usually got closer to a man. Pat chose a nice restaurant on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, which was his area. The food was delicious. They began with chickpeas and yogurt, then had chicken for the main dish. Laura didn't know what it was called, but it was wonderful. For dessert, they had baklava, which tasted heavenly, and the richest coffee she had ever tried. Pat didn't eat much, focusing instead on making sure she was having a great time. After dinner, they walked to the Brooklyn Promenade, a walkway above the busy road. The view of the Manhattan skyline lit up at night was stunning. As they walked hand in hand, Pat suddenly kissed her. It wasn't like the sparks she had expected. Instead, it felt warm and comforting. Looking into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in any other man before. It was a look she struggled to define. When he kissed her again, she felt a strange ache in her chest. The night didn't end in a typical way. They continued to walk quietly, just enjoying each other's company. It was the most romantic evening she had ever experienced. With the welcoming park around them, the beautiful city glittering across the dark water, and the tall, kind man who would pause to hold her and kiss her, she felt lost in a dream. The next morning, waking up alone in her bed, Laura felt an unfamiliar joy. Half asleep, she suddenly realized what it was. The look in Pat's eyes was about love, not just physical attraction. Every other man had only wanted her for her looks, but Pat wanted to truly care for her. This joy, however, came with some worry. Did he see her for who she really was? She decided to take things slow because she wanted to protect her heart. She was worried this might be just another short romance that would end in a few months. She wasn't sure she could handle that. It would mean her dreams of having a home and a family would be gone. Soon, Laura saw that Patrick was different. He understood the challenges of her job, and he changed his schedule to fit hers. For the first time, she felt like she was in control of the relationship, and it didn't seem to bother him at all. Laura was almost 27, while he was only 21. He still had about 2 years left in law school, but that made him even more available to her. His only good friend was Stephen, which worked out since Laura quickly became friends with Susan. The four of them spent a lot of time together, which was great for Laura, as she didn't have many close friends in New York because of her busy job. This also allowed her to keep some space between Patrick's affection and her own insecurities. It seemed Susan had a similar experience with close friends. She was friendly with many people but didn't have strong bonds with most. Susan shared that she found it hard to make friends with women due to her looks, and said most men only seemed to want one thing. However, she believed Stephen was different. Their friendship wasn't based on romance. She could talk freely to him, often sharing her thoughts until he would surprise her with something very wise that made her think. Neither Patrick nor Stephen liked sports. In fact, they disliked watching games on TV. The best way to make them leave a room was to turn on a sports event. But they enjoyed playing games, both physical and mental. They weren't the best students, but mock trial was very important to them. They would spend 2 days getting ready for a competition and at least a day recovering afterward. Finally, Laura got to see one of their trials. She was excited for 2 reasons. She would see Patrick in action and hopefully meet Edward Kincaid. Ironically, they were matched against her old school Yale. She thought they might lose, but hoped it wouldn't be by too much. She was surprised. It turned out to be a one-sided match, but Yale was the team that lost. Teams could have 2 or 3 student lawyers. Brooklyn's team had 3 members, Patrick, an Asian girl, and Stephen. Patrick started his presentation right on time, speaking clearly and confidently. Yale began strong but fell behind quickly. By the time Stephen finished, it was a landslide loss for Yale. Laura sat in her seat, amazed. It was like she was watching 2 different people. The shy Patrick she knew was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a confident and skilled speaker stood at the center, capturing everyone's attention. She started to wonder who Patrick was and where he had come from. Laura met Ed Kincaid, who was very proud. He called his team his men, and you could feel how proud Patrick and Stephen were when he praised them. That night, Laura took Patrick back to her apartment. She thought about being close to him, but he became sick. He had chills and kept throwing up. She put him to bed in her room and lay next to him, just holding him. This seemed to help, and in the morning, he felt better, but still tired. Over the following weeks, she noticed this pattern repeating. He would get sick after events and be tired the next day. When she told Susan about it, Susan mentioned that Stephen felt worn out too, but he didn't get sick, just felt shaky. It must take a lot out of them to act like that, Susan said. Laura could only wonder. She knew she could never be a trial lawyer, but she felt something wasn't right. One day she ran into John Stringer III in the elevator. He was a lawyer with a long family tradition in law and had done trial work when he was younger. "Mr. Stringer," she said nervously, surprised to be talking to someone so important. "Yes, Laura," he replied with a big grin, clearly happy to recognize her. He thought, "I'm not so old that I don't know the name of the prettiest young associate we've had in years." "Well, it's about my boyfriend. He does mock trials and is really good." She paused, unsure how to continue. "But," he prompted. Well, he gets a bit sick to his stomach afterward. He chuckled and said, "Ah, to be young again. Laura, he has stage fright." "But he gets sick afterward?" she asked. "Yes, he feels nervous before and after, like butterflies in his stomach," he explained. "Does it go away eventually?" she wanted to know. "No, you just get used to it. Or you move to something like commercial finance," he replied with a wink. The elevator stopped, and he stepped out but turned back to say, "Don't be a stranger. If you ever need help, you know where to find me." Susan was getting married. She felt proud that she had gotten Stephen to propose. Before he could finish, she had already picked a date. "I think a June wedding is traditional. His exams will be over then, and I can plan a 2-week vacation plus take advantage of the 4th of July weekend if I organize it well," she told Laura. "Yes, but he'll still have a year of school left." "Oh, Laura, you don't think he's going to pay for everything. I have enough money for both of us." "But he's so young, Susan. At 22, he's old enough, and I'm over 27. It's time for me to be married." Susan wasn't listening to any disagreement, and in a way, she was right. They were in love, so why wait? Stephen would probably never earn what she did as a junior partner at Gary Partners, a top PR firm in the country. After school, he would be lucky to find a job that paid $50,000 a year. Susan, on the other hand, already made 5 times that amount and had a family with serious money. She had a successful career. Like Laura, Susan went to the best schools and had a great job. There was no way Stephen could compete with her. In fact, one of his best traits was that he didn't try. He was happy being the supportive partner. "So, are you up for some fun?" Susan asked. "How so?" Laura replied. "You, me, and Stephen's sister Lisa. Let's have a good time every chance we get until I get married." Laura knew Lisa. She was tall, just like her brother, standing almost 6 feet. She was very slim and had been a runway model for 4 years at just 19. Laura understood what having fun with Lisa meant. Lisa was almost as pretty as her brother, but unlike him, wasn't shy. "Susan, if I go out with you two, I'll feel like an ugly duckling," Laura said. "Oh, come on! You got nothing to worry about. We'll have guys all over us," Susan laughed. This kicked off the longest party for the 3 of them. Whenever the women had free time outside of work and away from their partners, they would go out. A typical evening started at a trendy bar where men would line up to talk to them. Even with plenty of other women around, the 3 of them would draw in all the attention. Susan, as Laura quickly saw, was very choosy. She liked men who were big, strong, and well-dressed. She was attracted to confident guys who took chances. Laura often wondered what Susan saw in Stephen. "Oh, it's simple. He has everything I want to come home to. Good looks, a nice personality, and real love. I know he loves me and always will. I never have to worry about silly arguments like I would with other guys. What I want matters to him. He lets me live my life the way I want to, and he is secure enough that I know he won't cause trouble. He only wants what I can give him. There aren't many men out there who would put my career ahead of their own. Stephen is always in my corner." Laura thought she could say the same about Pat. "Susan, with the money your family has, why are you so eager to succeed?" Laura asked. "Oh, you sweet girl. The DeVoe family money was almost gone by the time my mom married my dad. She had the name and a little money to help him start a business. My dad is a gambler. A good one, but still a gambler. When people think of our family business, they assume it's insurance, but it's really reinsurance, handling the big risks. Dad is like the casino owner, not the one losing at the table, but eventually, luck can turn. We've had our money troubles every few years since I was little. My older sister Mary remembers it even more than I do. My dad might win big, but he can also lose big. I need to be able to take care of myself." Laura simply thought to herself that you never really know what life can bring. She let him rest for a while before trying to make him feel excited again. She didn't really enjoy giving him attention like this, even though she found it easier than other ways. Back in college, she had tried different methods, but while guys liked it, they usually weren't good at it. It was the fastest way to get a man's attention, so she carefully moved closer and began to touch him gently. "Want to change things up?" she said. Susan made the guys leave, saying she needed some sleep before her fiancé arrived. They actually took the time to clean up, so when Steve and Pat showed up at 7:30, they were sitting around the kitchen table in cozy white bathrobes, all fresh and clean. Susan had managed to get away with everything, but Laura felt a strong sense of guilt. She had never done anything so wild before, making her wonder if she was now a bad person, especially worrying about what Patrick would think of her if he knew. Would he even want to see her again, knowing what kind of woman she was? She reminded herself that she hadn't betrayed Patrick. They were not engaged, and they had no serious agreement. They were just two people who liked each other. They had never been intimate. She thought he was too young and inexperienced. She hadn't sunk so low as to lead him that far. If they were to take their relationship to the next level, it would mean a lot more than just a wild night. She respected his feelings, but she also knew what she had done was not right. She wanted to be the person Patrick deserved if she wanted to stay with him. Laura stood up from the table and gave Pat a hug and kiss before leading him to the second bedroom. It was there that she decided no more casual flings, and she wanted her relationship with Pat to grow slowly, making sure not to scare him away. She would honor his values, but their love would have to become more intense, because now she fully understood how deeply she loved this man. Susan's wedding to Stephen was held in New Canaan, Connecticut 2 weeks later. Susan looked stunning in her white dress. The wedding was quite a big event, mostly attended by her mother's relatives and her father's business partners. Susan didn't have many close women friends, so she didn't invite any of her past lovers. Laura was asked to be a bridesmaid since Pat was the best man. He was above her now, looking down. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked. "Yes, but are we being careful?" he replied. She laughed and said, "I'm on the pill, my love. Oh, my sweet love." July turned into August and summer was over. Patrick had to go back to school, and so did Stephen, who was now living in Chelsea with Susan. Laura began urging Patrick to move in with her. "It will give us more time together," she argued. "But—" He didn't finish his thought. "What? You don't mind being close to me but don't want others to know?" she said, realizing she was being unfair. He didn't want to tell his very religious parents he was with her, and she understood that. But she loved him and wanted him to marry her, not in the future, but now. She had come to agree with Susan. There was no reason to wait. She was ready, and whether he liked it or not, he was hers. "Laura, please let's figure this out," he begged. "Okay, but I love you and want to be with you. You should understand how tough my job is," she said, her voice asking him to see her point. But under her plea was a hint that she felt he didn't love her enough. Laura had started to play with Patrick's feelings, and this pattern would continue. She knew if she kept pushing, he would think that proposing was his only way to escape. An engagement would bring them some respect. He might think he could delay the wedding for a long time, but she would change that soon enough. About 2 weeks into the new school year, he gave in. He was worn out, trying to keep up with her while also getting back and forth between his parents' house and school. She made it tough until he finally said yes. The engagement ring was small, only half a carat. He used every penny he could gather for it. Most of the money came from playing cards in the student cafeteria. He and Stephen made sure to win against everyone. They knew they would find it hard to get a game for the rest of their law school days. One person they played against was Ed Kincaid. Ed played bridge, but he couldn't match Stephen even when he made Patrick play one round with him. Kincaid hated to lose, just like Stephen. Even though the ring was small, Laura valued it deeply. She took Patrick home to meet her family, her mom, dad, and 3 younger sisters. Her family liked Patrick. She was the oldest by 7 years, and the next 3 sisters came in quick succession. Her dad wanted a son, and she sensed he was hoping for that in Patrick, but worried he was too different and not very into typical guy interests. Once again, Patrick surprised her. When her dad talked about sports, Patrick kept up with him. He didn't know the players' names or the stats, but he understood the basics of each sport, what it took to win, and what could lead to losing. It turned out that almost every game he and Stephen had played, Stephen had found a way to cheat. Laura and Pat couldn't afford a big wedding, but that wasn't what Laura wanted anyway. She kept it small and simple. They spent their honeymoon in Las Vegas. It was budget-friendly. They stayed for 4 days over Veterans Day. Pat had a lucky streak at blackjack and won $5,000, which made the casino staff glance at him curiously. Susan and Stephen joined them for the last 2 days, and the 4 of them had a wonderful time. By Tuesday, Laura was back to work. 2 years later, Laura told Pat they were moving to Albany. Pat had graduated, passed the bar exam on his first try, but he still didn't have a job. A position opened up for a senior associate working with municipal bonds in Albany, and Laura saw a chance for a promotion. Jobs like that were rare after the recession, so they made the move. When they arrived in Albany, Laura said she wanted to settle down. The housing market had just fallen, and she thought this was a great time to buy a house. Pat found a part-time job with the Van Patten County District Attorney, working nights at the village court. Laura found a lovely 2,200-square-foot ranch in a nice area called Redmond, near Albany. Pat agreed with her choice. Pat wasn't happy with his job, but his bosses seemed to like him. Within a year, he was promoted to a full-time position, even if the pay wasn't great. Everything was fine until Frank Patterson came along. Patterson was tall, fit, and very good-looking, in his mid-40s. He was a senior partner and a Harvard law graduate, the type of man who drew attention. He began in the Washington office and worked his way to Albany. From the start, he was friendly with Laura. He complimented her clothes, her work, and especially her looks. It felt like he was flirting, which was nice, but Laura was married. At first, she didn't flirt back, but he didn't give up. Laura found herself in a tough spot. The firm, Brentwood Stringer, had been hit hard by the economy, which meant fewer chances for promotions. She was waiting for her turn, having moved to Albany to improve her chances in a smaller office while working in a more profitable area, municipal finance. She couldn't just turn Patterson away, and asking for help from higher-ups would only hurt her chances. She felt stuck in a difficult situation. In the end, she decided to go along with it. It wasn't just about her. She told herself it was for Pat and the family they both wanted. Although Pat had never really talked about having kids, just once during their first time together when he worried about being careful. If she mentioned starting a family, Pat would talk, but he never brought it up himself. Well, he was younger than her, and guys usually didn't stress about that sort of thing. She needed the partnership, and she needed it quickly. Patterson saw her weakness easily. She wanted her name on the list of partners. He dangled the promise in front of her, and eventually she took the bait. It wasn't until the firm's Christmas party that he really secured his grip. That night, when he met Pat, he wondered what all the fuss was about. Pat seemed weak and unimportant. He thought Pat might even thank Frank for making his life easier. Patterson chuckled to himself. The first night Frank had Laura at his house, he took her straight to his bedroom. He wanted to show her who was in charge. The next time they were together, he crossed a line she hadn't expected to go over. At that moment, he thought Pat was truly feeble. Frank looked down on men like Pat. He believed their partners were easy targets and they couldn't do anything to stop it. He made it a habit to date as many women he worked with as possible, enjoying the thrill of getting involved with married women. This often led to trouble, and he had been moved from one office to another. They didn't fire him, though, because he had a senior partner position he gained through office politics. Until now, complaints about him had not been formal. He thought everything would be fine when he was done with Laura. From the start, Laura was not happy with the relationship. It wasn't that the intimacy was bad, just different. Frank tried too hard to be in control. She liked being taken charge of sometimes, but she also enjoyed being playful and free. In the end, he was simply too old and forceful for her liking. By February, their affair was coming to an end. Frank was certain Laura would end things after the partnership meeting if she got the promotion. He tried to see if he could interfere quietly. But Solomon was firm, saying she deserved it, and the senior partners agreed, surprisingly including Mr. Stringer. So, Frank had to wait and see how things would turn out with Laura. She gave him one last moment on President's Day, telling him she thought her husband might be suspicious and that she needed to end things. He didn't believe her until Pat confronted him, and everything fell apart. The police stopped Frank about a mile from the bar where he had been drinking. Pat had approached him after one of his weekly networking meetings. Frank had few clients of his own and was trying to build a client base in case the firm decided to push him out. He knew Solomon was keeping a close eye on him. He could not afford a public scandal. When Pat sat at the table, Frank realized things could get messy. He was relieved that Pat didn't want to make their issues public. That made sense. Pat wouldn't want everyone to know he couldn't keep his wife. He went along with the conversation, sipping his drink and talking about how important it was to keep things quiet. He didn't notice how the waitress kept filling his glass. Frank should have called a taxi, but instead he drove carefully along a route he knew well. However, the police were waiting for him. They were from the Van Patten County Sheriff's Department, and they were serious. They took him to a small town court where they guided him inside. It didn't hit him that he had been arrested until they asked if he wanted to call a lawyer. Suddenly, Stephen Fitzgerald, a well-known defense attorney, was next to him. Stephen led him to a private room and explained what was going on. In short, Frank was in big trouble, but he could get out for $200,000. At first, he couldn't believe it. Patrick Sullivan, the weak husband, had set him up and was asking for money. Frank had spent most of what he earned. He owned a fancy colonial house and a Mercedes-Benz SLS GT, which cost nearly $250,000. He also had a boat on the river and a summer camp in the Adirondacks. To get the $200,000, he would have to take money from his retirement savings, which would cost him in taxes. That annoying Sullivan was going to force him to scale back his lifestyle. Frank didn't like being pushed around by some kid from Brooklyn, a lousy little assistant district attorney. He thought he deserved more than Sullivan, who he believed should give in to him. Somehow the weak husband had outsmarted him, but Frank was determined to get back at him. June was Laura's secretary. She knocked on her boss's office door. June knew Patrick and often said how lucky Laura was to have him. Laura wondered what June thought now. "Mr. Solomon wants to see you," June said, concern showing on her round face. "Are you okay, Laura? Should I tell him you need a moment?" "No, I'm fine," Laura replied. She walked through the office without looking around and headed for the elevators to go to the floor above. Saul Solomon had a big office on the 5th floor. It was often used for meetings with important clients and by the Government Affairs Group, which lobbied the state and federal governments. Margaret, Saul's executive assistant, told Laura to go right in. He was waiting for her. As she entered, the strong sunlight from the large windows temporarily blinded her. The sun was shining from directly behind Saul's big desk. He wasn't sitting at his desk. Instead, he was in a cozy spot off to one side of the office, where 2 comfortable chairs and a small sofa created a friendly setting for conversation. On a small coffee table, there was a teapot and 2 delicate cups ready. "Come sit with me, Laura, and tell me how you like your tea." He motioned for her to join him on the sofa next to his chair and started preparing the tea. Laura felt very uneasy. She could tell that Saul was at his most unpredictable when he acted the most polite. "Mr. Solomon, I'm sorry for all the—" He stopped her with a wave of his hand before she could finish. "The apology should come from me," he said. "And just call me Saul like my partners do, Laura," he added. He set down his cup and leaned back, his hands resting on his stomach. "I knew about Frank Patterson's ways. I tried to keep the newer staff safe, but I didn't warn you or give you the same protection. I thought you could manage him." He paused for a moment, but I see that wasn't the case. "I should have understood how tough your home situation is. I don't want to sound unfair, but men from Ireland can be very emotional at times. I guess Mr. Sullivan reacted strongly to your situation and took things too far," he said, chuckling a little. Laura couldn't help but let out a small laugh, even with her worries. Saul had a talent for making big problems seem trivial. "Yes, his reaction was over the top, but I doubt he sees it that way. As I said, men from Ireland can let their feelings lead them. I assume he didn't just hurt Frank's pride," he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's just say Frank was seriously hurt." "Good. Maybe this will be a tough lesson for him. He can't keep getting moved around each time he causes trouble. There are risks we need to think about." "But now," he said, "we need to talk about you. Laura, you are my partner. In today's world of businesses and corporations, we often forget what being a partner really means. I do things differently. Being my partner means our work is shared. We take each other's business seriously. In this case, it has clearly affected our work here. So first, I need to move you. Starting tomorrow, you will be in governmental affairs, and Jim Smallwood will take your spot in municipal finance. But I know very little about lobbying, and won't Jim see municipal finance as a step down?" Now Saul laughed heartily. "Well, first, having a charming woman like you with him will only help, and second, you don't know Jim well if you think he won't see this as his chance to push Frank Patterson aside and move up in the company." She had to admit he was right. Saul had a way of coming out clean, even in messy situations. "Thank you. I will do my best," she said, putting her cup down and preparing to stand. Stay seated, he said, filling her cup with more tea. We still have to address your husband. If only to show that we won't let anyone win against us. Oh, please, Mr. Solomon, don't hurt Patrick. I've caused him enough trouble. I just wish I could undo everything. Saul smiled. I was hoping not all was lost. I like your husband. Let's see what we can do to bring him back to you. I believe that would be best for everyone. But he wants a divorce. He made me sign an agreement. Miss, this is one of the best and most powerful firms in New York. One young man isn't going to beat us. Saul didn't say that he and Jack Stringer had decided to stop the divorce no matter what happened. Jack didn't think you should leave a marriage at the first sign of trouble. He told Saul directly, I've seen them together. The young man is very immature and he has a quick temper. He seems calm, but you can tell he's angry inside. Still, it's clear he loves her, and she loves him. If we can help him grow up, this can work out. All right, Jack. I will delay this divorce and hope he matures. Saul turned to Laura and said, You have friends here, and we believe your husband just needs some time to think things over. Then he picked up the phone and called Angela Zink, the head of the family law group. They spoke for a few minutes and agreed that Laura should ask for counseling before the divorce could go through. They knew they could ask the judge to order it. Next, he made a long-distance call. Hello, Bella, he said. She could only hear his side of the conversation, but they talked about Laura's problem. They discussed ways to help her. Then he arranged for Laura to meet Bella Moskowitz, the best marriage counselor around, he assured her. The only issue was that Bella was in New York City, and Laura would have to go there. When Laura left Saul's office, she felt like a new person. She had hope again and saw her situation differently. With the help Saul was giving her, maybe she had a chance to get Patrick back. Governor Kincaid was stuck in his office in Albany. It was the second week of April, and spring had come to New York City. However, the weatherman was predicting snow in Albany. Somehow, the legislature was preparing to pass the governor's budget almost exactly as he had submitted it in January. This was surprising because his opponent, State Senator Tilden, was leading this effort. Ed Kincaid was suspicious. It felt like, as the poet Browning said, "Mornings at 7, God's in his heaven, all was well with the world." In reality, it was 10 in the evening, and Don Pleasant wanted to speak with him. "Send him in," the governor told his assistant, Betty. Don walked right through the office and headed into the governor's bathroom, where he turned on the faucets full blast. The governor stepped in and closed the door behind him. Patrick Xavier Sullivan, only child. Went to St. Gregory's School, then Xavier High School, and later Fordham University. He graduated from Brooklyn Law School and now works as an assistant district attorney in Van Patten County. He's married to Laura Parker Yale, who also graduated from law school and is a partner at Brentwood and Stringer. Don paused, a smile forming on his face. One clever, brave, and sharp guy, Don said, and his smile showed he had a liking for Patrick. It took Don around 40 minutes to share everything he had learned about Frank Patterson's cheating and the extortion involved. While the bribes were mostly guesses, there was proof that condos had received the money and LaCour was expecting more. The governor was shocked. He never thought Patrick Sullivan would be involved in something like this. "Can we prove it?" the governor asked. "Not a chance. Fitzgerald is as clever as they come. You'd have a better chance of finding a needle in a haystack." "Thanks, Don." "Any time, Governor, and I have to say I like the way the kid operates. Sullivan is okay in my book, but Fitzgerald? He's not trustworthy." Kincaid knew Don's advice made sense. He had to keep an eye on Fitzgerald, whose morals were very different from most people. To Stephen, the world was complicated, with no clear black and white. Fitzgerald was risky because he understood both sides and believed in them. Sullivan, on the other hand, was smart, but believed in right and wrong. He was the kind of man you could count on to do the right thing, but now he had clearly crossed into the wrong. The important questions were if and when he would come back to the right path, and if he didn't, could he be of any help? "Betty, can you get me Arnold on the phone?" the governor asked. It was nearly midnight when Betty finally reached Arnold Flecker, the governor's appointments secretary. "Governor, Denise says you're not supposed to call me after 9 p.m. Denise was Arnie's wife and had started making rules. Tell Denise it's urgent. I need Patrick X. Sullivan to be appointed as interim district attorney of Van Patten County first thing tomorrow. Who is this guy? He's my secret weapon and knows how to handle tough situations. I don't expect you to get it, Arnie. I just want to set him up in case I need him. I am Patrick Sullivan, married to Laura Parker. I guess the fact that she doesn't use my name says a lot about our marriage. The problem is, until recently, I've been a bit ignorant about my soon-to-be ex-wife. I feel like one of those guys who gets fooled by a pretty face, then wakes up realizing he made a big mistake. Right now, I'm in a courtroom, usually my favorite place, but not today, since I'm the one in trouble, not my lawyer. My lawyer, Jeffrey Davis, just call me Jeff, is explaining my case to Judge Roxanne Clearmont, who everyone at the Van Patten courthouse calls Rocky. It's not because of the boxer, but a cartoon squirrel. I'm not sure exactly why she has that nickname. Maybe it has to do with her loud and sharp voice. Rocky isn't paying attention to good old Jeff. Jeff is dependable and not too expensive. But my wife's lawyer is different. Angela Zink is a tall, cool blonde in her 40s, trying to look like she's in her 30s. She isn't wearing the usual dark suit that women lawyers often wear. Instead, Angela has on a fancy champagne-colored dress that goes just below her knees and has a high lace collar. She looks graceful and stylish, but she is also very tough. I've been in enough courtrooms to know when things are going down the wrong path. Trust me, this is one of those times. It should have been straightforward. The separation agreement was already signed. Sure, the deal was unfair, but back then I was really angry and had all the power. I was threatening to report her boyfriend to the police. Yes, I felt betrayed. Still, I thought I would just deal with my wife's side, and since I was calmer now, Jeff could handle the talks. But Laura had a different plan. I could tell when she arrived in a new dress. It wasn't just new, it was what you'd call a Susie homemaker dress. The kind that says, "I bake cookies for the holidays." Her hair was tied back, and she was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Angela offered her a box of tissues. Laura does not bake. Before we lived together, I'm not sure she even knew how to use a kitchen. Her family always joked about her cooking skills. She has 3 sisters, and they all tease her about not being great at home chores. She's a strong attorney and isn't embarrassed about not being a traditional housewife. I pulled Jeff aside. "Put her on the stand. I bet she won't last 5 minutes." Jeff just looked at me, frustrated. He was already having a rough time. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have something to add?" Rocky asked me. "Your Honor, I just wanted my lawyer to show the court that, despite how my wife looks today, she is a very skilled attorney and not just a housewife," I answered. "The court knows what each of you does for work. But let me remind you, Mr. Sullivan, this is not a trial about right or wrong. This is about a troubled marriage," Rocky said, taking a pause before hitting me with the next point. "I believe that the 2 of you may have decided to separate too quickly. The law lets me order counseling in such cases. Since counseling is something that Mrs. Sullivan had started working with a well-known counselor, and since she agreed to cover all the costs, she said, 'I'll set up counseling here.'" Then she whispered something. Jeff jumped up and foolishly asked what the judge had said because he didn't hear it. I said counseling once a week until the court is satisfied. Jeff opened his mouth to argue that he had never heard of something like that, but I grabbed his elbow to stop him. "We've been tricked. The game was rigged," I said. "No use in being upset." Then I looked at Laura and her lawyer and gave them my best "it's not over yet" smile. It took me 2 weeks to get the written order, and I only got it after I threatened not to follow through unless I had it in writing. My friend Stephen Fitzgerald helped me read the order from Judge Rocky Clearmont. "Well, you have to give credit to Saul Solomon. He's a really smart lawyer," Steve said, shaking his head. "You won't blame me if I don't think he's smart right now," I replied. "Hey, are you forgetting we're the ones in trouble? He has truth, justice, and the support of most judges behind him. I don't see why he needed to get involved." We knew Laura didn't get the order for marriage counseling by herself. The real issue was with the Zink woman, but it didn't take long to find out that Judge Clearmont had lunch with the chief judge the day before our hearing. That kind of pull had to come from someone very influential. "You embarrassed your wife and her partner, both of whom work with him. People know you hurt them. Just because no one can prove anything as long as Laura and Frank stay quiet doesn't change the fact that it was humiliating," Steve told me. "This order is absurd. It can't stand," I said. Patrick, please tell me all the time you spent in the DA's office hasn't made you lose your mind? No. I see he doesn't need to win. He's just buying time. But how long can this go on? I pointed to the order. It depends on what you do. The order says marriage counseling paid for by the other side, and a progress report is due in a month. It also picks a counselor who is well-respected and skilled. But it has no end date and requires a lot of travel. It also chooses a counselor that your wife likes, but you don't. Those are all good reasons to appeal and argue in court. So how do I go against a big law firm that has so much power? We go along for now. In 6 months, I'll move the case back to court with good old Rocky. What makes her decide then? Certiorari. Either she grants the divorce, or we take her to court for not making a decision. Even if Saul tries to delay us in court, we can make a choice, and there's really only one choice to make, right? Stephen explained to me. You're right, as always. I see that, but I don't like being pushed around, I replied. So how's this pride thing going for you? I couldn't help but grumble back at him. Listen, this is the price you pay for revenge. I hope it turns out well for you, he said. On the second Tuesday in April, I found myself in an office building off Fifth Avenue in New York City. I took the train down that morning. The round-trip ticket cost $102. Not a lot, but over $400 a month, which was hard on a poor ADA like me. They thought I would reach for the money I got from Patterson, and then they would have me trapped. I couldn't help but smile at their low opinion of me. The building was a decent walk from Penn Station, but not too far. The meeting was on the 7th floor of an 11-story building. When I walked into the office, it felt very welcoming. There were magazines on the tables, mixed with coloring books and crayons. There was no receptionist. A sign told me to ring a bell, so I did. A woman in her 60s, wearing a long hunter green dress, let me in. The room had 4 big, comfortable chairs and a small coffee table. A small desk was pushed against one wall. It was a cozy room, lit warmly to make it feel friendly. Laura was already there. It was clear they had been chatting, and I knew what they were talking about. Hello, Patrick. My name is Bella. Let's just use first names here. We'll be Bella, Laura, and Patrick. Is that okay? Bella said as she looked at me with her deep brown eyes. I guess that works, I replied. I know you don't want to be here, but since you are here, please give it a try. I just want to help you. It would be a shame to waste this chance because of pride, she said kindly. I nodded in response. Okay, here are the rules. You need to attend 1 session together each week, and before that, each of you will have a 50-minute private session with me to talk about anything you want, though it would be good to talk about why we're here. She paused, then continued. You can't miss a session without going against the court order, but if something important comes up, we can reschedule. Because of the open order, I must report to the court every month. I will tell the court when I think you are both ready to end the counseling. Is that acceptable? She asked, looking at me rather than Laura. I nodded my agreement. Great. And to introduce myself further, I am a doctor and have a PhD. I have more than 30 years of experience in marriage counseling. I have written several books on this topic, and I teach at NYU. Now, about the schedule, I hear you're free on Tuesdays, Patrick, and Laura said she can be available that day, I said. Tuesdays are okay, but Patrick has night court that evening, Laura replied calmly, as if it was just a normal thing to mention. Tuesdays work for me, but I need to catch the train at 1:20, I said. But we could drive together, Laura suggested. No! It's all good. There are early trains. I'll meet Laura at 9 a.m., then Patrick at 10 o'clock, and both of you at 11:30. That gives Patrick enough time to get to the station. He can walk to Penn Station from here. Also, Patrick, you both have homework to do together, and you might want to use the travel time for that. It's not a must, just an idea, Bella said, wrapping up that part of our meeting. Okay, first, I won't judge anyone or place blame. I'm not here to decide if what happened is good or bad. Second, I won't label you as the hurt and the one who hurt. You are 2 people in a marriage. One of you did something that caused pain to the other. You both need to face it and accept your part of what happened. It may not be equal, but you have to take some responsibility, she explained. So she cheats, and I'm the one to blame? I asked. Is that what I said, Patrick? Bella replied softly, as if talking to a young child. What I meant is that you both share responsibility, not equally. So, Patrick, you aren't fully to blame, but you do have to take some of the responsibility for what took place, Bella continued, steadying herself and giving me a look that said to calm down. Lastly, I'm not here to keep you together. We will look at what is best for both of you. Hopefully, we can decide together what is best for you both. After this, she asked Laura to share about our marriage without discussing the affair. While Laura spoke, Bella's eyes were focused on me. I felt like she was trying to see into my very being. When the session ended, she walked us out. As we left, she leaned in and whispered, "Pat, I know being here isn't what you want, but I hope you're strong enough to make the most of this." With that, we parted ways. I understood Bella's plan. She wanted to break my pride so that I would take Laura back and let her take control. That was not going to happen. On the train ride back north, I turned on my phone and checked the news to pass the time. The Times-Union had a headline on its website, "Unknown Appointed Interim DA in Van Patten." The article only shared the basic facts: when I became a lawyer, where I studied, and how long I worked at the district attorney's office. There wasn't much more, and I expected they would update it later with more details. Let them wonder. But the best part was that Laura would be really angry. She would understand how I got the job, and I wouldn't be the weak person she could push around anymore. I was the district attorney. I had a job, maybe just for 8 months, but for once, I felt important. On the Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, I had my first meeting with Bella Moskowitz. I arrived just as Laura was leaving. I waited until she was gone, so I was a few minutes late. Bella told me straight that she expected me to be on time. "How are you sleeping, Patrick?" she asked. "Fine, why shouldn't I be?" I replied. "Well, it seems like you've done some things that are not right, if not illegal. Though I'm no expert like you are," she said. "I don't see any proof that I did anything wrong." "Is that your standard now? Your wife tells me you have strong moral values. Is she wrong?" "When did this become about me being guilty? I'm not the one who did wrong here. Is that really what you believe?" "Where are we headed with this?" I asked. "I believe that you need to forgive yourself. But you can't do that until you forgive your wife. You see, I've seen many men like you. You did things to escape the pain of your wife's mistakes. Laura didn't realize how much it would hurt you. I know it's hard to accept because you see it differently. Your wife's lack of bad intention doesn't lessen the hurt for you. You tried to avoid that hurt, but it won't work. You'll keep feeling this pain until you face it. So forgive and forget and everything will be fine?" "I didn't say that. You need to start by forgiving, and then you must make things right to regain your own respect. You can't be at peace with yourself now, and you've pushed away the person who loves you most. Patrick, you are lost. Let Laura help you find your way back." "Sorry, I'm not buying that. She did wrong. She chose him. As far as I'm concerned, she can stay with him." "That's fine. I'm patient. You'll come to see things differently eventually. Sooner would be better, but we can wait." She was right in some way. I was missing Laura. The past week had been terrible. Being in this awkward position as DA wasn't easy, especially when the higher-ups were resentful of me for ruining their comfortable setup. The senior staff in the Van Patten DA's office thought they could take the benefits while leaving the work to others. I had disrupted that plan. It was either work hard or leave. They were scrambling to find new jobs. On the other hand, a few people thought I was doing well. It was strange. It only made me feel worse, like I hadn't truly earned my role, which, if I was honest, was probably true. "So, tell me, Patrick, what do you say to people who ask how you became DA?" Bella asked. The woman was sharp. She could quickly find your weak spot. "Don't you read the Schenectady Gazette? I used to study under the governor. He helped me because he saw my natural talent," I said, trying not to smile, but she joined in my grin. "Does anyone actually believe that?" she asked. "Everyone believes it so much that it is now treated like the truth. As we lawyers like to say, don't mix up facts with the truth. Facts can confuse a jury and get in the way of what they want to believe," I replied. "I didn't know you were so cynical," she said. "Life teaches you lessons. Just like I thought, your wife is just a target for your anger, but the real issues go much deeper, don't they? You're good, but this isn't going anywhere. She cheated, plain and simple. No, I think there is more to it. You let her cheat to excuse your own actions. Poor Laura felt trapped. She thinks she is more responsible than you are. But that's an illusion. You have always had the real power. You just needed to show it. Are you sure about that? Yes. But I wonder when you will stop punishing her for being weaker than you. So much for me being the victim and sharing blame, I said. Did you think I wouldn't see the truth? Or did you plan to confuse me with your lawyer tricks? So she gets to be with other men while I just watch? She wanted what most women want, a child. She waited to start a career, but it was bothering her. She was an easy target for someone like Patterson. She had a husband, but he didn't stand up for her. Maybe he doesn't really love her? I loved her, and I knew I couldn't hold her back. She didn't believe in me. So you showed her? Yes. Then forgive her. It's the right thing to do. She is in a lot of pain. The quality of mercy is not strained. It falls like gentle rain from above. It blesses both the giver and the receiver. It is the most powerful thing. I should have known you'd quote a female lawyer, but what happens to me? How can I consider myself a man if I accept this? She looked at me with deep eyes and said, I believe in you, Patrick. You are truly brave. You won't let me down. You have too much courage to worry about what others think. It was 4 in the morning on a Sunday, and, not counting today, I had been the district attorney for just 12 days. The house on Indian Hill Road was a simple 2-bedroom ranch. It had a garage at one end that people often turned into an extra bedroom or added to make it larger. It likely sold for over $100,000 a few years back during the peak, but was now empty after the market fell. Until now, the only crime that had affected this place was the mortgage fraud scheme run by the biggest banks in America and their partners in the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury. Sergeant Brandt from the Sheriff's Patrol met me on the front porch. He looked serious. It's in here, he said quietly as he led me through the front door into the living room. In the middle of the room was a body. It was a shocking sight, and I felt like I was in a dream. The soft carpet was soaked with blood beneath the body. The carpet looked fairly new, and I wondered if the last owners had thought long and hard about its color, just as Laura and I did for our little house. Right then, I missed her the most. I wished she was there to help me bear this weight and share her smart ideas with me. In one corner, 3 other sheriff's deputies stood together, while my chief investigator crouched by the body on a dry patch of carpet. Philip Sloan was a short, heavy-set man in his 60s. Just 11 days ago, he became the chief investigator for the Van Patten County District Attorney's Office, which meant he worked for me. He was my first hire, even though he had no real law enforcement background. He was a private investigator before he took a part-time job with my predecessor about 10 years ago. We had worked on many cases together, and I knew he was the best I had. He had no political ties, which was good because I didn't want to deal with politics. So it's hard to identify him, but not impossible. The amount of blood shows he was alive when they did it, Phil said. I could see everyone watching me, Brandt, Sloan, and the 3 sheriff's deputies. I just nodded. I wasn't going to get sick if that was what they were expecting. I had Brandt call the state police and give them some wrong directions, so we would have time to look things over first. We took pictures of everything. He has needle marks on both arms, and his tattoos say he's a Hell's Angel. Identifying him shouldn't be a problem. The body was in a faded white t-shirt and a pair of black leather pants. No jacket? I asked. No, either they wanted to keep it as a trophy or to send a message. I would guess it's the latter, Phil replied. You think it's about drugs? I suspect so. It's probably about a fight over shipments going to Vermont and New Hampshire. The drug route to Vermont went through the Capital District of New York. Van Patten usually wasn't involved, but someone clearly wanted to make a bold statement, and I felt like I had stumbled upon something major. The fact that the headless body would make headlines but likely wouldn't get noticed by the state police was the reality I had to face. The state crime lab was the best place to get help, but the state troopers felt more like cowboys than police officers. It seemed like we would need a lot of luck to solve this case with our limited resources. In time, the case might be solved, but that would likely take years. Someone would have to share information to get out of trouble. Meanwhile, since this happened while I was in charge, I knew I would be held responsible. My chance in the next election would probably be ruined. I looked around at my team and saw they were thinking the same thing. I had already lost many staff members since I took over, and those who were still here were thinking about leaving too. This tragic murder was just another heavy burden for me. Without Laura by my side, I felt all alone. My only real friend, Stephen, was busy with a big murder case in Westchester County. I realized I needed to step up and show that I could lead. My dad used to say that problems come our way for a reason, and that we have what it takes to handle them. Let's do our best and trust that everything will work out, I said. It felt right because I saw hopeful smiles on their faces. As I left the room, the state police arrived. I quietly hoped they would do their job without making any mistakes. Katrina Gomez had stepped in as my secretary. Just 2 weeks earlier, she was the least experienced person in the office. But things changed quickly after many people left. I couldn't blame them. Most were just looking out for their own political future. Katrina buzzed me to let me know Phil Sloan was here. Phil walked in with a stack of folders. "We know who our victim is and have a good idea," he said, placing the folders on my large desk as acting district attorney. "Good afternoon, Phil. Nice to see you," I replied, but he waved my greeting away. "No time for small talk. We have a case to crack." He explained that the victim was Ricky St. Simons, an ex-member of the Hells Angels. Ricky was involved with a group of women, mostly former prostitutes, who looked good enough to blend in as housewives. They had a deal with a local used car lot, which provided them with minivans. They made trips to Vermont once or twice a week to bring back a shipment of heroin. "That's what we found in those tracks. Heroin," Phil explained. "So the victim was a heroin transporter?" I asked. "No, he was just transporting it. The real dealers are these guys," he said, pulling out files on several individuals from a black biker gang called the Vultures. They operated from New York City to Albany, using Ricky to get the drugs into Vermont. "It seems there was trouble among all of them," Phil noted. "So we have our victim and our suspects, but no evidence," I pointed out. "Not yet, but we do have this," he said, sliding the last folder across the desk to me. The murder weapon was a machete, and the victim had been killed in a gruesome way while still alive. It was a tool that had been used before, twice in New York City, but in neither case had the end been cut off. However, it left marks that the experts recognized as unique. "They can tell what the tool is?" I asked. "That's what the state people say, if we can find it," Phil said with a big smile. I could tell he was picturing the fun and trouble we would have trying to find something that was probably hidden well. Still, it was a chance we couldn't ignore. A week later, I found myself in a small, empty room with no windows, barely bigger than a closet. Across from me sat Kathy Loomis. Her big brown eyes were locked on me, and not in a friendly way. I had taken her and her 2-year-old son from the hallway outside the social services office. We were just down from where she had signed up for benefits and met with a job advisor. The sheriff's office was in charge of keeping the peace there. Brant had made plans to get our team in place so we could grab them without being seen. Kathy's older son was nearly 5 and attended a nearby preschool. Kathy had pale skin and blonde hair, which made her dark eyes stand out even more. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice full of anger. She was pretty but not stunning. Her main features were her eyes and her slim figure. Percy Jackson, known as P-Jack but called PJ by his close friends, preferred his women small and fair. Kathy was his girlfriend up north. He had another one in NYC who looked just like her, but she had 3 kids. Kathy's 2 boys had lovely brown skin. Officially, they had no fathers, but Percy wasn't one to let his women go until he was finished with them. So there was a strong guess that these boys, along with his 3 in the South, were his. "Miss Loomis, I am Patrick Sullivan, District Attorney of Van Patten County." She scoffed at this. She was putting on a rough front, but I hoped she was clever enough to see through it. "So, Mr. DA, what do you want from me?" "I need some information, just the answers to 2 questions. Do I look like a fool to you?" "No, in fact, I hope you will be very smart." "Really? You see, I'd like to avoid putting such a nice young woman in trouble for welfare fraud and taking a mother away from her children." She just smiled at this. "You have nothing, and I know it. They brought me here because my benefits are being reduced now that I've been on them for 5 years. The workers said I should find a job and that they'd help with daycare and bus fare, but honestly, taking care of 2 kids is a full-time job." She seemed proud, but I had her right where I wanted her, though she didn't realize it yet. "Not quite as full-time as you think. You have been going to school full-time for your nursing degree. It's strange you haven't mentioned that since social services could help with daycare and bus fare for your education. And you don't need bus fare since you have a 2-year-old Chevy. It might also be tough to explain how you paid for your tuition and books. I've heard St. Rose College costs a lot of money. My mom helps me. Except she passed away a year ago, but anyone looking at her Pioneer Savings Bank account wouldn't know that, I said as I handed her the bank statements. Nobody goes after people for this kind of thing. I'm just trying to make my life better, trying to leave welfare behind. The system is just so unfair. It doesn't give people a chance to succeed. She was right. The main lawyer for Van Patten until his sudden death was Tom Maitland. His ex-wife Beth worked at County DSS and often complained that the DA didn't care about welfare fraud. The problem is, outside the big cities, there isn't much major fraud happening. The locals call this area Small Baney because everyone knows each other. When fraud occurs, it's usually minor. Someone might forget to report a job or a new address. The DA's office has a limit. They won't prosecute cases under $3,000. That kept most cases from being taken seriously, so we focused on more important crimes. That was the case before, but I'm making progress. I have you for not reporting assets, like a nice car and cash going in and out of this account. Do you want to take a chance on fighting these charges? She looked at me sharply. Are we being recorded? No, do I look foolish? I just forcefully took a woman and her child. How do you think that looks for me? Okay, so what are we doing? 2 questions. First, 2 weeks ago on Saturday night, who was P-Jack with? I believe you are his alibi and can tell me who he was really with. No, I won't betray PJ. Didn't ask you to, just need to know who he was with. Between you and me, this won't go further since no one knows you're here with me. Got it, she said, and I handed her a yellow notepad and a pencil. She wrote down the names and handed the pad back to me. Last question, I said as I looked over the names. Who has the machete? She paused for a long moment, then circled a name and dropped the pencil on the table. Standing, she asked, Are we done now? Yes, I replied. I got up, walked to the door, knocked, and Brant opened it. When the coast was clear, he let her out. He gave me a look, and I could only smile. We had a crucial piece of the puzzle. This one, I said, pointing to the name she circled. We follow him wherever he goes. Bella was a determined woman. She kept pushing me to the edge, almost making me want to snap, but I thought I was strong enough to handle what she threw at me. Naive was the best way to describe what I was. The joint session started as usual, with Laura talking away. The private meeting with Bella and me at 10 a.m. went smoothly. She threw a lot of tough questions at me, but I managed to dodge and defend myself. Then she turned on Laura like a snake ready to strike. What do you mean you regret what you did with Frank Patterson? Bella asked, her voice sharper than before. Well, Laura struggled to find the right words. I had always wondered what my wife did in Patterson's room, but I was too scared to ask. Bella was not afraid at all. As I watched in shock and growing discomfort, Bella started to pull details from Laura. She didn't let Laura avoid the question. The more Laura hesitated, the more Bella pressed for answers. I felt a mix of sympathy and anger for Laura. Even though I disliked what she did, it was clear that no matter how good it might have felt back then, it was now a painful wound for her. Bella continued to reveal parts of Laura's past before we got married. She didn't say the words directly, but her meaning was clear. She thought Laura had a bad reputation. A different picture of Laura began to form. She was not the strong person I believed her to be. The woman I knew seemed confident and even a bit bossy, but this Laura seemed unsure of herself. She worried about her looks and thought men only wanted her for shallow reasons. It was surprising, but I believed it because the Laura I thought I knew would never admit to feeling out of control. Laura's face was stained with tears. I always thought it was strange how her nose would run so much when she was really upset. She sat there, tears falling onto her chin, her nose dripping, and she looked like she would never stop crying. After what felt like forever, it ended. I stopped listening. It hurt too much. When I finally looked at my watch, it was 1:30 p.m. I had missed my train. Don't worry, Laura can't drive back home like this. You'll have to drive, Bella said, as if we had just been chatting about gardening. As I helped Laura up and out, Bella waved cheerfully and said, See you both next week? Laura looked at me, and I could see fear in her eyes. I was sure my own eyes showed only confusion. Bella was her counselor, and I couldn't understand why Bella had treated Laura so harshly. It took a while to find Laura's car in the parking garage 2 streets away. I helped her into the passenger side of the BMW convertible that I recognized well. I drove a 5-year-old Honda Civic that Laura had bought for me. The BMW was a fancy sports car we got 3 years ago when we moved to Albany. It was meant to be a special gift for both of us, but I never drove it. I preferred the Honda. I guess I don't fit the typical idea of a manly guy. I just don't care much about cars. As a kid in a middle-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, no one had a car because we had no places to park them. Our lives were about taking subways and buses. The BMW was almost paid off. She really liked that silly car, I thought as I helped her get inside. I didn't care for Laura's car at all. I even thought about taking it away from her, but it cost too much to keep, and I didn't want to see it. To her, it showed that she was an important lawyer. Part of me was annoyed by it. I realized that the car was more than just a fancy thing. It was a way for her to feel better about herself. The drive back to Albany was quiet. I had trouble at first getting out of the city. Even though I grew up there, I had never driven in it before. I was shocked by how much they charged for parking. It was nearly the same price as my round-trip train ticket. Laura was curled up in the passenger seat, looking almost asleep. About the time we got to Newburgh, she began to cry softly. I didn't know why, but I put my hand on her shoulder and squeezed it gently. That made her cry even more. "Laura, please, it's over. Can you sit up and try to stop crying?" I said. "You don't know how much I miss being close to you. I know that sounds silly, but sometimes I just need to touch you," she replied. I didn't know what to say. "I miss the way you used to look at me. I know you hate me now and don't want to see me anymore, but I miss you so much," she said, and then she cried harder. When we got to Selkirk, I asked her where I should take her. That's when I learned she was staying with Susan and Stephen, who actually lived together. But Stephen wasn't home. He was out of town helping a woman who had clearly done something terrible. As we reached Becker Road in Altamont, memories of the nice times we had on this drive came back to me. I noticed that the long drive up the little hill to Susan's house was now paved, which showed I hadn't been here in a while. It used to be a small farmhouse, but now it had 6 bedrooms and a big garage. There was also a barn out back they planned to turn into an office one day when Susan had kids, and Stephen became a stay-at-home dad, working part-time. I wondered how that plan would work now that he was getting so much attention for his job. I parked the car by the garage. Laura turned to me and said, "I never loved anyone like I loved you. I'm really sorry. You may never forgive me, but please remember the good times we had." Then she rushed out of the car, across the stone path, up the porch steps, and into the house. I got out and closed the car doors. Just then, Susan came out of the house. It was a little before 4 in the afternoon, and I was surprised to see her home so early. She came down the porch steps with her arms crossed, looking at me with a serious face. She wore jeans and an old Fordham University sweatshirt that must have belonged to Stephen. She was still the most beautiful woman I knew. "You feeling good about yourself, Pat?" she asked. "It wasn't me. It was that counselor," I replied. "I get it. You had nothing to do with this. You just act like a child and nothing is your fault," Susan said. I could have said some mean things back to her about how she acted, but I held back. "Please, Susan, stay out of this." "How can I? 2 people I care about are getting hurt over silly stuff." "It's not silly to me," I shot back. "So sure of yourself and strong. You have no patience for us who are struggling. I hope someday you and Stephen learn what it means to be human." With that, she turned and went back inside the house. I called a cab on my phone while walking to the street. It took 40 minutes to arrive, giving me time to think about Bella Moskowitz, Roxanne Clearmont, Angela Zink, and other so-called good women who I believed secretly disliked men and made life tough for us. I also thought about Susan's last words. What did they mean? I didn't have to go to night court that night, which was one good thing about my new job. Around midnight, I got a call from Stephen. "Hi, Pat. I would ask how things are going, but I already know," he said. "Yeah? What did Susan tell you?" "Well, she said you're impossible, immature, insensitive, and maybe a bit crazy. Those are just the I words. I listened to over 2 hours of your faults," he joked. "Sorry, that's not your problem. I know you're dealing with your own stuff." "It's fine. It was a good break." "So how's it going?" I asked. "Could be better," Stephen said. "Really that bad?" "Yeah, the other side isn't making many mistakes. She's good, I'll give her that." "Just one person?" I said. Stephen laughed. "Yeah, she's the one who bends the rules. Usually, women aren't seen as great trial attorneys. They often prefer getting along rather than fighting, and a trial can be rough. You have to give nothing away and hit where it hurts. But there are exceptions." "I just wish I wasn't starting out behind," he said. "Oh, what's that?" I asked. Stephen hesitated and then quietly said, "The client is innocent." I didn't know how to respond for a moment, so I just said, "I'm sorry." "Not your fault. These things happen," he reassured me. "Everything good with you and Susan?" I asked. "Why do you ask that?" "She mentioned something strange when I saw her about you and me not being human," I explained. There was silence for a while, and then he said, "I think she's having trouble with my success. I'm not sure, but that's my guess." "Well, I might lose this one and things will return to normal," he said. We ended the call with a promise to meet for a drink when he got back. Jenny Trudeau described herself as a skinny white girl when we first met. We crossed paths because she had been arrested for solicitation, but the arrest didn't seem right. "I may not be perfect, Mr. Sullivan, but I can spot a cop when I see one. This charge doesn't make sense," she said. She was right, and I chose to let it go and move on. She thanked me then, and I hoped she still felt that way. "So what do you want, Mr. Big Shot DA? Need my help? I hear things aren't great at home," she said. In this town, nothing goes unnoticed, and I knew the gossip was swirling since I filed for divorce. "I need a different kind of favor," I replied. "You can ask, but what I owe you from before was just because you're a good guy," she said. I showed her a set of photos. These photos were usually shown to a witness instead of a long lineup to identify someone, but in this case, they were all suspects, members of the Vulture's bike gang. I saw recognition in Jenny's eyes. "You know these guys," I said. "Yeah, and I don't owe you anything like that," she replied. "The DA needs your help, and I promise it won't come back to hurt you." It took me almost an hour to convince her, but she finally agreed. We needed to create a story. Most of it was true. She had been in the Vulture's clubhouse doing her job. We just added a few overheard conversations about Samuel Tatro, also known as Tater, and how he had a machete. "Here's our story. All you need to do is tell it to Sergeant Brandt, and he will handle the rest," I said, feeling confident we'd get the search warrant we needed. "I trust you, Mr. Sullivan, to take care of me," Jenny said. I promised her it would be fine. Honestly, I wasn't completely sure. We found the machete in a storage locker in a small town north of Albany called Watervliet. Following Tater paid off. Now we just needed someone to talk. I brought Tater in and kept him in a room for 23 hours, charging him with possession of the machete. Next, we brought in Little Tom, also known as Thomas Lexington, a tall man weighing 285 pounds. There was no way the 5'7" Tater could be responsible for the murder of Ricky St. Simon. I figured that was Little Tom's doing. By the time we began questioning Little Tom, he realized Tater might have turned on him, and he gave us what we needed to make further arrests. They struck on Memorial Day weekend. I was just 6 weeks into my 8-month term. I understood how Russell DeWitt, the Republican chairman of Van Patten County, was thinking. The DA's office looked like the sort of opportunity he'd want to take advantage of. In a strongly Republican county, an empty office was a nice gift. The new guy, Sullivan, had seemed fine when he got into trouble with that strange case. Now he had made some arrests, and the same journalists who were criticizing him just last week were now saying he was the best district attorney in the state. I knew I had to rethink my whole plan. I needed to deal with Dexter Ealing, a candidate the public recognized but didn't really know was so unqualified. I could probably find a better candidate next time. This gave me a chance to run against Dexter, and I was excited about it. By the end of August, we had been going to counseling for almost 5 months. It had been many weeks since the session where Bella had strongly challenged Laura. Bella had spent that time helping Laura heal. Laura was almost the confident woman I had married again. I could see there was a purpose in Bella's tough approach. I could tell that Laura was close to forgiving herself. I was even slowly becoming ready to forgive her, too. But I was not ready to stay married to her. To me, my life with Laura was finished. "What's wrong, Pat? Can't you move past your pride?" Bella asked in our private session. It's not that. I can't get over the dreams I once had. I think I married too young. I was immature, just like some people say I still am. I saw her as perfect, like a goddess. I guess I just wasn't seeing things clearly. Who really knows the person they marry? We all wear masks in public. Marriage is partly about learning to love the other person for who they are, not for who we wish they were. You may have been naive, but you don't have to stay that way, she said. You're right, but it's time to grow up and move on, like you've said. But I want to move forward without Laura. Bella shook her head. You're really tough, but one day you might regret this choice. You married Laura with God as a witness, for better or worse. That's a strong bond. You belong to her, and I believe God has a way of bringing people back together, so I'll leave this to him. I'll tell the judge that counseling will end at the end of September. Until then, I'll help you two separate. Is that okay with you? She looked deeply into my eyes. Sounds good, I replied. She shared the same news in the group session, and Laura looked sad, but I thought she took the news well. When I left, Brant was waiting in a sheriff's cruiser. I was being escorted everywhere. The death threats started coming right after the 4th of July. By early August, the FBI had warned us to take them seriously. The Vultures had hired expensive lawyers from New York and were fighting against the charges. Both Tater and Little Tom were trying to retract their confessions. The big city lawyers were claiming the evidence wasn't reliable and should not be used. They were shouting about an illegal search, but they weren't discussing small-town courts and unfair treatment, which reminded me of people in white robes. When I got into the sheriff's car, Sergeant Brant passed me his phone. It showed a text from Phil Sloan. It said just one word, Geronimo. Brant had a big grin, like a child on Christmas morning. The code word wasn't new, but it was perfect. It meant our plan had worked. It was a very simple trick, but I knew it would work well. About 3 weeks earlier, we learned that the FBI planned to put one of the girlfriends of the Vultures into witness protection. Her name was Jasmine Turner. She was one of the few women who spent time with these bikers and also happened to be black. She didn't have any kids and wanted a fresh start. The feds managed to turn her, but sadly, they told us she didn't know anything about the St. Simon murder. That was okay because she had the initials JT. Those initials matched Jenny Trudeau, and that was how we referred to her in all our files. Jenny's full name was never used. Our task was to make everyone believe that JT stood for Jasmine Turner. Phil, Jack Brant, and I let the feds take Jasmine, and then we quietly searched for her. Soon, even the people in our office believed our informant was Jasmine, and we couldn't find her. The Vulture's lawyer thought they were in the clear. The hearing to challenge our case was going to happen on the second Tuesday after Labor Day. I had a day off from counseling that day, but Geronimo meant our main opponent had fallen for the plan. Dexter Ealing wanted to lead the DA's office, which he believed should be his. We learned he would be on the local news early next Sunday morning. We hoped he would attack me, thinking I couldn't win the hearing. Geronimo meant the reporter set to interview Dexter was going to ask about the hearing. Phil had a contact at the TV station. We were planning to let him walk right into the trap, but we had to win that hearing. I want to help with the hearing, Mary Ellen Seaman said from in front of the large desk that always felt strange to me. I was thinking about changing it once I won the election. I know you might doubt my skills in court, but how can I get better if you don't let me try? She asked. She was right. I didn't have much faith in her skills, and she couldn't improve without more chances. I had also begun to respect her. She had courage and didn't leave when I took the DA's job like others did. She deserved a shot. Okay, you can help, but it won't be easy. You need to prepare the witness and ask her questions. But we don't even have a witness, do we? I smiled. The first lesson here is how to trick people, I said. Mary Ellen was just right for the task. She spent a whole week writing questions and getting ready to ask a witness she couldn't meet. I gave her all the details and helped her make the questions, even coming up with 2 or 3 different ways to ask each one in case someone objected. We practiced it a lot. Finally, Mary Ellen was set to question Jenny over a secure phone call. I wanted to be very careful. On the second Tuesday in September, the Van Patten courthouse was closed to everyone except those who really needed to be there. Jenny was in the main courtroom, hidden behind a screen that only the judge could see through. She had been secretly brought into the courthouse in a trunk, and that was how she would leave too. Judge Drago was at the front and looked surprised when the New York lawyers came in. Jenny was behind the thick screen. "Your Honor, we object to this setup. We have the right to confront the witness. They shouldn't be able to hide behind a screen," started Thomas Jacobson, the main lawyer for Percy Jackson, also known as PJ Yak. "Mr. Sullivan?" the judge asked. "Your Honor, this is a confidential witness for a good reason. There are dangerous men involved who harm their victims. Our witness will be known as Miss Jane Roe in this case, but we will tell you her real name," I explained. "How can anyone know if you really have her true name, Judge, or if she is just a government spy?" Jacobson argued. Before I could respond, the judge spoke. "Mr. Jacobson, I know this lady. In fact, I have known her since she was a child. I do not need the district attorney to tell me who she is, so unless you have another objection, we will proceed with her testimony." "Mr. Sullivan, you may start," the judge said. I leaned over and whispered to Mary Ellen, "You can do it. To win a case, you need 3 things: preparation, and a bit of luck. That day, we had all 3. Mary Ellen was very prepared, and she believed every word of what Jenny said. Jenny and I had worked hard to create a story that was built on some truths, making it hard to separate the truth from the lies. Mary Ellen made it all feel believable. She was a bit nervous and new to this, and because I let her take the lead, it showed I was completely confident in our case. Mary Ellen started by asking Jenny about her job. Judge Drago shook his head and asked, "What would your parents think, Miss Roe?" "Judge, you know my husband passed away, leaving me with our 2 boys. The Social Security money and my small workers' compensation payment don't cover everything," Jenny replied, reminding the judge about the workplace accident that had taken 2 lives and injured 6 more. All of them had been former General Electric workers. When GE decided to leave, they handed over a job to a small company that was made just for that. Unfortunately, this new company did not offer the same insurance benefits as the big one did. Jenny was left to cope as a widow, and she did her best to move forward. Hearing Jenny explain her choices made me think of Laura. I wondered if she chose family over her own dignity. Maybe she did, but her reasons seemed less serious. The final blow came from the other side. Jacobson and the lawyers for the 5 defendants all took their turn, but Jenny stood firm. Jacobson was the last to speak and aimed to question Jenny's character. "Miss Roe, you said you overheard a conversation after you finished working and were on your way to the bathroom to get ready for more work. You can't remember everything, but you said you had worked with 4 or 5 men by then. Is that right?" Jacobson asked with a sarcastic smile. "Yes, that's right," Jenny replied. "So what does that make you?" he pressed. "Just what I told Mr. Sullivan when I first met him. I'm just a regular person trying to get by," she answered. Even Drago found a reason to laugh, and that's when the skilled lawyer lost, because Jenny's version of the story became the accepted truth. After leaving the courthouse, we found 3 local TV stations with their news vans waiting for us. I forced myself to smile and express my thanks to the judge and the brave witness. Our story made the 11 o'clock news and was talked about again the next morning. Dexter was not available to comment. Donations started coming in. I received a big contribution from Saul Solomon, which I suspected was really from Laura. I was grateful for that. Edward Kincaid and Stephen also sent generous amounts. But these donations were small compared to the $100,000 sent by a man I didn't know from Vermont. His son had died from a drug overdose, and this was his way of fighting back. Many others gave smaller amounts, $25 or less. I was surprised. Some included notes that praised my efforts or thanked me. I felt undeserving of this support. This all started from my anger over my wife's betrayal. Now people looked up to me for things I was ashamed of. When I shared this feeling with Bella, she looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through me. As I mentioned before, this all comes down to you accepting what you've done. It doesn't matter what others think when you know your own truth. Despite what you try to convince yourself and others of, there is a truth that doesn't change based on circumstances. Was she right? I wasn't sure anymore. I got caught up in the election campaign. It turned into a real battle. I am not a politician. Going around shaking hands and meeting people is very hard for someone like me. It took all my strength to get through countless interactions. To make things worse, Dexter got a big break from the authorities. They made deals with the vultures and quickly moved them into protective custody. One headless body was not worth as much as the important information they had about the drug trade. We tried to negotiate for at least one person to face charges, but it seemed a deal had already been made. The state attorney general announced this deal at a press conference. We had to either accept it or challenge the state. The governor kindly sent me a thank you note. Before I knew it, it was the first Tuesday in November. Election day started clear and bright, but it rained later. As I got ready that day, I thought back to where I was a year ago. I was preparing for the Leroy Johnson trial. It was strange that I hadn't thought about him in a long time. He had received probation, and I heard he was back with his wife. I had gotten through my troubles and burned some bridges, wondering who felt better. I visited the polling places that day. The poll workers, both Democrats and Republicans, welcomed me with enthusiasm. Around noon, I bumped into Tommy LaCour. He thanked me for bringing new life to the party. "I can't thank you enough, Pat. Win or lose, we owe you. I've never seen the party so energized," he said with a big smile. There were rumors that voter turnout was much higher for an off-year election. This wasn't a surprise. In the presidential election, a little over 25,000 votes had been cast in the county. Dexter had raised and spent over $175,000. I actually spent more than he did. Together, we had spent nearly $15 for every vote. It was unusual, but the Republicans still had twice as many registered voters. Just before 6 in the evening, I left the last polling place. Brandt was with me, out of his uniform, along with about 24 officers who had been supporting me all day. He got caught up talking to some people as we left the Polish-American Community Center, where the 14th election district voted. I stepped into the street just as it was getting dark. I heard a motorcycle before I saw it. When I looked up, the rider was coming toward me fast, wearing a helmet, and had something in his right hand, a bat or a pole. It was clear what he planned to do. I could run, but I knew I wouldn't get away. Just as he got near me, I heard a loud bang. The rider slumped over and the motorcycle went out of control. It nearly missed me, but the back wheel hit me and threw me against a parked car. The motorcycle went tumbling after. The room around me wasn't completely dark. Light came in from the hallway and a big window. I was in a bed and felt wired to many machines nearby. Someone entered and leaned over me. I guessed it was a nurse. "Take it easy. Don't try to move," she said. "He's awake," she called, turning to someone sitting nearby. A figure stood next to the nurse. I didn't need to see her to know who it was. It was Laura. They brought me some water and told me to stay still. "Don't try to move. You need to rest. Something isn't quite right," the doctor said. I realized later this was an understatement. I had injuries from the accident, and my head injury had caused a stroke. By the time I was in the hospital, the stroke wasn't too serious, but things were rough. My right arm was broken, and my left arm and leg didn't work properly. My head felt like I had been hit hard, and I was just in pain. The doctors and nurses were friendly and told me I would probably recover well, but probably meant a lot of work was ahead of me. A kind female doctor started visiting me on my 3rd day in the hospital. She didn't say it, but I could see that she thought I was struggling. "It will take time and a lot of effort from you," said the head doctor, whose name I never caught. Laura was always there with me, and I couldn't make her leave. She ignored what I wanted and took charge. She spoke to the doctors and made decisions for me. One of my nurses was a new graduate named Kathy Lumius. She had convinced security that she was there to help me. Kathy was very nice and thanked me for getting rid of a man who had been causing trouble in her life. "By the way, he isn't really," she said. "What do you mean?" "He isn't what people think. Either that idea about him is a myth or he's just an exception. But I'm glad he's gone. Those dumb agents asked me if I wanted to go with him, like I would be that stupid." On the 6th day, they sent me home with Laura. When I tried to remind her that we were getting a divorce, she just laughed. "We had that nonsense dismissed," she said. "Who will take care of you if not me?" If you want to know, I lost the election by less than 200 votes. It was very close. The Republicans lost 7 seats in the county legislature and most of the town councils. Dexter was happy about his win until reporters started asking him about my attack. The man on the bike was dead, shot by Brandt, who saw what was happening as he left the Polish Community Center. Brandt acted quickly to stop him, but people wanted more answers. The news articles worried about the lack of justice in Van Patten. "Will the drug trade come back now that Sullivan is gone?" they asked, as if trouble was just waiting to return. Laura did her best to keep me away from all of it. She had to go back to work the third week I was home. She arranged for a male nurse and physical therapist named Donald. She turned our family room into a therapy area. Donald worked with me hard to help me get back on my feet. But he was honest. Everything might not come back to normal. I would be able to walk, maybe even fast, but probably not run. I might need a cane or crutch, but not a walker. I could use my arms with some trouble, but he hoped it would get better over time. Don was determined, and so was I. I promised Laura that as soon as I could, I would start the divorce again. Even I knew it sounded like just a dream. I still had a long way to go. About 4 weeks after I got out of the hospital, Laura took me to see a new doctor. I hadn't had a regular doctor before. Dr. Elizabeth Harper was a family doctor, or at least that's what the sign said. She checked me over and said I was doing well. She praised Nurse Donald Pleasant, Jr. for his help. "Don is great, and you're doing fine, Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Harper said. But mostly she spoke to Laura about what I needed. Then, with a smile, she said, "I think you're ready to make your wife happy again." I understood what she meant as Laura started to blush. On the way home, Laura was very affectionate, but I tried to keep some space between us. It was hard. I had such strong feelings. I had managed to control my urges while running the DA's office and trying for a new job, but now I had time to think and no time alone with Don and Laura. I had said I loved Laura, but I hadn't been completely honest. She isn't the traditional beauty that Susan Singleton Fitzgerald is, but she has a different kind of appeal. I can't explain it. While Susan turns every head in a room for some reason, Laura attracts attention in a more intense way. It goes straight to your heart. Normally, I'm more resistant than the average guy, but when Laura wants to turn up the charm, I'm helpless. That night, Laura came into my room dressed in something nice. It had been almost a year since we had been this close, and I found it hard to resist. She focused all her attention on me. She started by kissing me in a way I hadn't expected. I honestly didn't know she could be so skilled. Even on the hottest day, her hands felt cool, almost like ice, but her warmth was inviting. I had been through a lot, but I was feeling good. Just her presence had me excited. She laughed as she got closer to me, making everything feel intense. "So, are you going to hold back as usual?" she teased. I think it's been too long for that. She was right, I couldn't hold back. She seemed determined to make this special. Each moment felt intense, and after a while I remembered a question I had asked ages ago back in Connecticut. "Are we being careful?" I asked. Her laughter was strong, almost joyful. "Why should I worry?" "I'm with my husband, and I'm about to become a senior partner. It's time to think about starting a family," she said. 3 weeks later, she showed me the pregnancy test with its little blue plus sign. "Sorry, Pat, but it looks like you didn't really think you could win this, did you?" Laura said. But the story wasn't over yet. There were more surprises ahead. All right, the main character is in a tough situation. I plan to help him through it, so hang in there. The Hudson River flowed beautifully toward New York Harbor. From the tall office building on the 44th floor, Edward Kincaid, the governor of New York, gazed out his window, taking in the view. The Hudson had been shaped by glaciers melting over 10,000 years ago. The river often felt like an arm reaching out to the ocean. The ocean's tide pushed north, sometimes reaching as far as Poughkeepsie, a city partway up the river. Now, as the sea level rose, the ocean and river posed a threat to the lives of millions in the big city below the governor's office. Kincaid had always imagined he would be the hero of his city, but as usual, he struggled to make it happen. That Sunday, he was in his office with 4 powerful men in state government. They included the Speaker of the State Assembly, the Senate Majority Leader, the Attorney General, and the long-winded Harvey Milhouse, Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, the highest state court. They had gathered to discuss the latest problem. Harvey was explaining, in his dullest manner, why the court couldn't decide in advance if a certain law was unconstitutional. In other words, he didn't want to risk making the party, and especially the governor, look foolish. The governor had taken a class on torts from Harvey at Harvard, and though he was just as boring there, he had been a bit more helpful. "Okay, Harvey, we understand. We're in a difficult spot, and you're not going to help us out," Speaker Stanley Schwartz said. "Well, I simply can't," Harvey replied. "This is all my fault," said Paul Devenback, the Senate Majority Leader. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Paul. Mistakes happen. The Republicans have held control in your House for so long that you're a bit out of practice," the Speaker said. For years, the Republicans had a narrow majority in the state Senate due to an agreement that allowed the upper house to favor Republicans while the lower house favored Democrats. It didn't matter which party got the votes in any specific election. The two political parties found a way to help each other, ensuring that each party had some control in the government, no matter how the voters felt. One night, State Senator Mark Hoffman took his wife to the Mercy General Emergency Room. She had injuries and said she fell down the stairs. The hospital staff didn't believe her and reported the situation to the authorities. However, nothing was done because the district attorney was Mark's brother. The Republican State Senate voted for a special bill to assign an outside lawyer to look into what happened. Mark was one of the few Democratic senators from upstate. The Assembly reacted, led by Stanley Schwartz, who was experienced in tough Brooklyn politics. Their bill called for the hiring of a special lawyer to investigate elected officials, known as a corruption czar. It was risky to support such a bill, so both houses passed their versions. The Democratic Assembly could say they wanted to investigate, while the Republicans claimed it was just for show. Everything was fine until Sherry Smith lost her battle with breast cancer. Stanley had a lot of respect for Sherry. She was a Republican, but always got along well with him. They teased each other about their differences, and she was passionate about women's and minority rights, even if she held conservative views. She had a tough district in Buffalo that should have favored Democrats, but she fought hard for it. Sadly, she lost her fight against cancer. Then there was Franklin Pleasley, a self-important man who got elected in a heavily Republican area. He passed away suddenly, but the details of his death were kept quiet. His passing meant 2 special elections, but the Republicans weren't too worried. They only stood to lose 1 seat. To be safe, they picked a conservative Christian mother of 3 named Sarah Monk to take Pleasley's place. She was in her early 40s, fit, and looked well put together. While she wasn't a model, she was attractive and could speak clearly. Many thought that Sarah, who was married to an oral surgeon, would win easily. Unfortunately, she lost. Sarah had been a stay-at-home mom who supported conservative causes with her husband's money and by volunteering her time. She even served on the local school board and town council. However, during her time on the council, she had a brief, minor relationship with a younger lawyer. Although it was over, pictures from that time still existed. Just 3 days before the special election, unflattering photos of Sarah appeared online. The news of the scandal came out too close to the election for anyone to fix it, and the last blow was the boyfriend's ex-wife claiming that Sarah was the reason for their breakup. In a more relaxed area, this might not have caused such a big fuss. The Democrats were overjoyed when they gained control of the state Senate. This celebration lasted just 1 day. The outgoing leader brought up the Assembly's version of a special counsel bill and then sat down. If Paul Devenbach had been more experienced, he could have united his team and shown strength against the opposition, but he wasn't that ready. The more extreme members on his side of the room knew exactly what they wanted: revenge. What better way to get it than to push through a bold reform bill? The best Paul could do was to change the bill to limit the term to 5 years. So there it was, a bill that no sensible politician wanted, just waiting for the governor's approval. Paul had supported this bill when he thought it would never go through. The last person in the room was Sid Levy, the Attorney General, an elected role in New York. It was a mystery how Sid, the most honest and caring person the others had ever met, ended up here with 4 tough politicians. Sid was 35, a father of 6, and married to Ruth, an Orthodox Jewish woman who focused on her faith and family. They met on a Sunday because the day before was the Sabbath, and Sid would have attended earlier, but the others knew he would face consequences from Ruth if he did. "Well, Attorney General, what do you think?" the governor asked. Sid had been anxious about this moment. He was never comfortable around these men, and now he had to give an opinion he feared they wouldn't agree with. "Well, the bill has some issues that could be fixed with the right choice. 1. It is too vague. It doesn't give a clear direction, which means you need a strong leader for the job. 2. There's no money set aside for this role, which means the person must work without funds until the next budget comes. I can help as best I can, but I can't hire staff for another agency. So you need someone creative. 3. Finally, you need someone independent, someone the public will respect but who understands mistakes. Not someone who acts superior, but still, I don't know, someone admirable enough for the public to look up to. My opinion is, if you find someone like that, go ahead and sign the bill and appoint them. But if you can't find the right person, veto it and accept the criticism. Sid finished his statement to a groan from the majority leader and the judge clearing his throat. The governor was strangely quiet. Then Stanley asked, "Do you have someone like that in your pocket, Ed?" The governor looked down for a moment before turning back to the window. He watched the Hudson River for a minute, then picked up the phone. "Betty, please connect me with Don Pleasant, Jr., not Sr., Jr." He turned back to the others and said, "Why don't we refill our coffee while we wait?" The governor had put his head of security's son in a position to keep him updated on Patrick Sullivan. It was better to be careful. As soon as he heard about the attack, he had concerns. The more he learned, the more he felt the situation needed close watching. His own role was small, and everything seemed stable for now. The phone rang, and Betty said, "I have Don Jr. on the line." "Don, how's the family?" the governor started. "All good, Governor. What can I do for you this fine Sunday afternoon?" Don replied. "I was curious about your patient." "I have several, but I assume you mean Mr. Sullivan. He's getting better. He won't fully recover, but in a few months he should be about 80%. "What about now? Can he work?" "Well, he is a lawyer, so it's not too physically demanding, but it would be smart to wait a bit." "And if I can't wait?" Edward asked, making it clear he was eager to proceed. He should be fine, and working could actually help him mentally. Don knew he was bending the rules, but refusing the governor was not an option unless he was absolutely certain, and he wasn't. "Thanks, Don. Send my best to your partner," Kincaid said as he hung up. The others mostly looked at him, except for Stanley. "Are you sure about Sullivan, Governor?" the speaker asked. "Yes." "Who is Sullivan? I've never heard of him," the judge asked. "Patrick Sullivan, the former interim district attorney of Van Patten County, is everything our attorney general is looking for, including being a hero," said Governor Kincaid. "He didn't go to an Ivy League school, Judge," noted Stanley Schwartz from City College, concerned that the judge might look down on him for it. In the end, they all agreed that the governor would sign the bill and quickly appoint Patrick Sullivan. The governor had one worry that he didn't voice. He was confident that any problems would be handled. This was a big game now, and minor issues were dealt with. Linda Siegel was resting on a big pillow on the king-size bed in Stephen Fitzgerald's suite at the Hilton Midtown. It was late Sunday evening, and they were enjoying each other's company after a nice dinner. They had gone to a fancy pizza restaurant that served thin, crispy pizzas. The food was decent, but the time together afterward was unforgettable. In their 3 days together, Stephen had shown her a lot of affection. Right now, they were enjoying a calmer moment, savoring their connection. His best friend Pat Sullivan's wife seemed perfect at first. She looked like a confident lawyer, but Steve knew better. Laura Sullivan wanted everyone to see her as successful and smart, but her need for approval made her weak. She was married to a strong man, and though Pat was his friend, there was no denying that Pat was tough. A wolf, really, and had no real weakness except that he was overprotective. Steve understood he was more strategic and less sensitive than Pat, which made him stronger. However, he also had many weaknesses, all related to women. He feared one day his attraction to women would lead to trouble. He sensed there was a woman out there who could outsmart him. Linda was definitely not that woman. When she heard that Carolyn Wellesley, accused of her husband Arthur Hale Wellesley's death, had hired a new attorney, she quickly decided to look into this new lawyer. What Linda found out made her cautious. Foxy Fitzgerald matched her nickname perfectly, and Linda wasn't going to underestimate him. She needed to stay alert and not be fooled. With the advantage of the home court, she made sure to use it. The judge and the media were on her side, and she took every chance to make the most of it. But as the trial neared its end, she began to feel nervous. Foxy was proving to be quite skilled. Instead of the tricks she expected, he presented a solid case for suicide. In the end, the jury sided with Foxy or couldn't disagree. Linda took the not guilty verdict hard. She had developed a bit of attraction for her attractive opponent during the trial. She was puzzled about how someone could look so good and still be straight. She decided to charm him. hoping to learn more about his client's guilt in the process. He was great at what they did together. He was incredible in bed and seemed to have endless energy. But when she tried to use her charm to get him to confess, she got an unexpected response. Linda was a sharp prosecutor, maybe not as shrewd as Steve, but she noticed when he wasn't being straightforward. It was just before they parted ways after a passionate night that the truth hit her. Oh my God, she was innocent, she realized as the pieces came together. If she had the note, why didn't you use it? She asked. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. But she knew there was a letter, and it had something the wife didn't want anyone to know about her husband. Carolyn Wellesley stood by her husband even after he passed away. This deeply affected Linda. The strong prosecutor had a soft side, and Stephen Fitzgerald noticed it. Okay, Lynn, I won't call you Might Mouse, but you can call me Foxy. You're right, I'm not a great friend. I focus too much on my work and can be dull. I'm not a good husband, and I doubt I would be a good dad. So when can I see you again? He asked. How about next weekend at my place? She replied. He kissed her goodbye, and they separated. As Linda drove back to Westchester, she thought about his wife. The wife was in a tough spot. She had a quiet husband, but not much joy. It seemed like she had a boyfriend, but that must feel like choosing a snack when there was a delicious meal available. Well, that was better for Linda, she thought. He's seeing that other woman, Susan said. Susan, isn't that part of it in an open marriage? Laura asked. Who said anything about an open marriage? Really, Laura, Susan responded. They were sitting in a nice cafe in Troy, a good spot for lunch or breakfast. It was Thursday morning, and they had feta cheese and spinach omelets in front of them. Laura was trying hard to eat the fruit that came with the meal. Being 5 months pregnant, she was trying to do well, which wasn't easy. She felt sick often and was very unhappy. Susan, when you stray from the rules, you put yourself at risk, Laura said. Speak for yourself. I don't believe in this eye for an eye thing. For starters, men can't keep up their end. Stephen never had to worry about sex. After being with someone else, all I want is to feel close to Stephen again. Can he say the same? No, no, no. Every weekend she has my man. I can't even enjoy my time with Tony because all I can think about is what that woman is doing with my husband. I'm sorry, Susan, but I think you gave a man with pretty low morals a free pass, Laura said. What about the pass you gave Pat? Susan asked. You think I don't worry? Since the governor made him special prosecutor, I've done nothing but worry. That office is filled with ambitious women, and his secretary, she dresses so revealingly, it's like she wants to be seen, Laura added before continuing. I just wish he still loved me, Laura said, tears starting to stream down her face. I'm sure Pat still cares, Susan said, but not very convincingly. We were close the other night, Laura said sadly. See, I told you. It's just that he's a guy and needs some time to get past his pride, Susan said. No, it felt like pity. I was cooking dinner and I had opened the canned peas and was warming them on the stove. Laura had made the instant mashed potatoes. That was the hard part. Then she put the steaks in the broiler. Suddenly she began to cry. What's wrong? I asked. I set the stove on fire. The grease from the steaks caught fire. Pat had to come and put it out, she said, managing to stop her tears. Why are you trying to cook? I'm trying to be a good wife, I guess. I got really upset. He held me and said everything would be okay, and then we shared a special moment together. It felt so much more powerful now, at least for me, Laura said, looking seriously at her friend. I need to tell you something. Pat has a record from when he was younger. He nearly hurt a man badly, Laura told Susan. How did you find that out? Susan asked. I was at the legislative office building when I bumped into an old law school friend who works there. It was during the time when they were checking Pat's appointment. We had lunch and she asked me about it. I pretended to know and told her it was nothing. Later, I asked Mr. Solomon and he said not to worry. Pat was young and got provoked. Laura looked guilty as she finished her story. Susan understood. It excites you. With everything Pat has done and knowing he has a history of violence, you feel a little scared of him, and that's thrilling. Laura nodded in agreement. So? Well, I used to take him for granted, but now it feels like living on the edge. I should hate it, but I don't. It's kind of exciting. Laura tried to smile. Then a thought occurred to Susan. Her husband must have known but never said anything. Philip Sloan was sitting in the halfway diner. He wasn't sure if it was even halfway between any two places. 2 weeks ago, he was hired by the new special prosecutor as a consultant. The newly elected district attorney of Van Patten County had fired Phil in just 3 days. It was surprising it took that long. Phil had been promoted to chief investigator in Van Patten County by Patrick Sullivan. When Sullivan lost the election, Sloan, as Sullivan's appointee, was in a tough spot. He could have filed a complaint, but all he wanted was a few more years on the job before retirement. He was 62 and didn't have time to deal with nonsense. He had gone to warn Pat Sullivan about the federal investigation. The attack on Sullivan wasn't gang-related. Anyone could see that. The man who was killed, a now lieutenant named Jack Brandt, was neither black nor in a biker gang. He was a Dartmouth graduate who had fallen on hard times due to drug use and gambling. The fact that he had money when he died told the whole story. Sloan had attended an AHH hockey game at the Knickerbocker Arena with an old friend from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They had been invited to sit in one of the VIP boxes. Sloan wasn't surprised to see that some local FBI agents were also invited. They started with simple, harmless questions, but it was clear they were trying to get closer to the truth. Phil was skilled at handling their tactics. He quickly learned everything they knew and led them away from the real story. Sloan felt he should give Sullivan a heads up about this. 2 days later, he casually visited the Justice Building in the Empire State Plaza complex. The locals called this area the South Mall, although there was no North Mall, and one critic had humorously said it looked like a mausoleum built by space aliens. On the second floor of the Justice Building, there were 3 small rooms that made up the office of the Special Prosecutor for Official Integrity and Standards. A small sign marked the end of the clerk's area for the State Attorney General's office and the start of the Special Prosecutor's space. When Sloan arrived, he was greeted by Sullivan's secretary, Katrina. She was a pretty young Hispanic woman who had moved with Sullivan from the Van Patten District Attorney's office. Sloan noticed she was dressed very nicely. She quickly showed Sloan into Sullivan's small office without any fuss. Sloan didn't wait for an invitation or small talk. He jumped right into what he knew about the FBI investigation. Sullivan was a serious man with strong opinions. After listening to Phil, he immediately made his pitch. He wanted Sloan to work for him and made it clear he wouldn't take no for an answer. So, I'd be a contractor. I do the work and hope to get paid in 60 days. I lose my unemployment benefits, won't earn credits for retirement, and I might not even get paid, Sloan pointed out. Yes, Sullivan replied. Okay, when do I start? Now. I need you to go to Western New York and look into the attack on Senator Hoffman's wife. Do I at least get travel money? No. Just keep a record of your expenses. The Attorney General might reimburse you, Sullivan said. So here was Sloan, sitting in the last booth of a small diner at 11:30 at night, waiting for Elizabeth Duncan. The former Mrs. Federo was the head nurse at Mercy General Hospital, a small facility struggling with financial issues in health care. The hospital mainly earned money from its emergency services and general medical care for Alton State Prison, a medium-security women's facility. Mercy was 30 miles from the nearest hospital and 15 miles from the prison. It provided essential services to both the inmates and the local community, which depended heavily on the hospital. Beth was the head nurse in the emergency room. Her job was to manage the team and make sure everything ran smoothly. 20 years ago, Beth Duncan lost her husband, Ted, in a car accident. He left her with 3 kids and not much insurance. Beth worked hard to raise them and put them all through college. Her dedication helped her rise in her job at the hospital. Jason Federo noticed this. Jay, as people called him, was a charming man. He saw that Beth was feeling lonely now that her kids had grown up. She married him, but soon she realized he was not the right partner. He was lazy and took advantage of her. Beth decided to divorce him, which was tough, and left her single again. Beth assigned shifts to the nurses. She often took on the less popular times, like the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shifts on Fridays and Saturdays, since she didn't have plans. At 59, she felt her age. After her shifts, she liked to stop for dinner at a diner called the Halfway. On a busy Saturday night, the Halfway was filled with people. Beth usually sat at the counter, but if a booth was open, she took that chance. One night, she saw a booth that looked empty, but as she sat down, she noticed Phil sitting there. "Oh, I didn't see you," she said, standing back up. "Please join me. I don't need the whole table. I would enjoy the company," he replied. Phil had a friendly face that put people at ease. After a moment, Beth agreed to sit with him. He asked her about her nursing job. She wore her scrubs, and he seemed impressed with what she did. "My job with the state is pretty boring," he said, but he didn't reveal much about his own work. They talked more, and before long, he asked her out on a date for Wednesday, her day off. Phil was persistent and spent the next 3 weeks getting to know her better. When he was not with Beth, he was gathering information at the state prison. Janet Hoffman had worked as a counselor at the prison for 17 years. She had many friends there, but they were not always open to outsiders. This made it hard for others to get information. However, they all knew each other well. Phil learned to listen carefully and ask the right questions that could uncover hidden details. If someone dodged a question, it often meant they knew something important. Eventually, Phil found out all he could about Reverend Jean Paul Belmont and Janet Hoffman. What he needed was the last piece of information that Beth, who was in charge of the emergency room the night Senator Hoffman came in with his wife, understood. Beth felt nervous and didn't know what to expect. She had brought Phil home, hoping they would share a special moment together, but at their age, she was aware of physical limits. As they went up the stairs to her bedroom in her cozy Cape Cod house, she worried about her body changes. She hoped the dim light would hide her wrinkles, yet she was also excited. It had been 3 years since she had a man in her room. "Phil," she said, looking at him, "it's okay if you don't want to." Beth noticed the comfort of his closeness and felt at ease. He was no boy, she realized. He wanted to savor the moment, and that felt nice. She understood what he intended to do next. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Just relax," he replied firmly. She took a deep breath and let it happen. Phil was skilled and patient. Afterward, they lay together, feeling sleepy and content. "Did that help you forget about that subpoena?" Phil asked playfully. "Oh, why did you bring that up?" she replied, feeling a twinge of guilt. "Sorry, but I really don't think it's a big deal for you," Phil said, knowing it was related to her. He had suggested it, thinking she would come to him for help, which she did. His plan was to take her out for a lovely dinner and charm her. "But you don't understand, Phil. I can't stop thinking about the Hoffman family," she said, sadness clear in her voice. "You mean the state senator?" "What does he have to do with you?" he asked, already understanding the situation. "I was there when his wife came in that night," she replied. "So what? It's just a case of domestic violence and the medical records are private. You're not worried about that, are you?" he replied. For a moment, she didn't say anything. "Maybe they want to know about the miscarriage," she said softly, almost too quiet for him to catch it. "That poor family," she continued. "I don't want to be the one to cause them more pain." "Maybe it was the senator's child," he suggested, already guessing her answer. "No, she asked if it was a boy or girl. We couldn't tell because she wasn't far enough along, but she asked like she already knew," she said, and then she started to cry. Sloan hugged her tightly, trying to comfort her. He wished he hadn't misled a good person like her. Katrina walked in to say I had a visitor. She was wearing a very short skirt and a blouse that clung to her in a way that made me uncomfortable. I needed to talk to her about how she dressed. "Mary Ellen wants to see you," Katrina said. "Who?" I asked. "Mary Ellen Seaman. We worked with her at the DA's office," she replied. "Did she say what she wanted?" I questioned, and Katrina gave me that familiar look that suggested I was slow to catch on. "Mary Ellen, nice to see you," I said as she walked in. She wore what I called the classic lawyer outfit, a dark skirt suit with a fitted jacket and a skirt that came to her knees. She had on high-heeled shoes and stockings. She looked just like a young lawyer. I offered her a seat and waited for her to start. "I was hoping you had a job for me," she said after a moment. I tried to think before answering. "Sorry, Mary, but I don't have a budget yet. There's no money to pay anyone," I explained. "Katrina works here, and I heard Sloan is too," she pointed out. "Yes, but they're not being paid right now. They have agreements that say they get paid if and when we have a budget," I said. "That's fine. I'll take one of those agreements," she replied. "But you're already working. You have a job at Van Patten," I said. "True, I have a job, but I want a real career. I don't want to be stuck in traffic court forever. I want to be a trial lawyer, she said firmly. Be realistic. You can get paid at a different job. Here there isn't much except a remote possibility, I told her. You're wrong. You're here, and I want to learn. We worked well together when you were the DA. I know you might not think highly of me, but I'm willing to work, and I'm not leaving. If I have to, I'll sit outside until you hire me. Plus, you need one woman in the office who's not trying to create distractions. I'm gay, in case you hadn't figured it out. I know you may not have noticed that on your own, she declared, making it clear she wouldn't take no for an answer. I hadn't thought much about her feelings before, but now it all made sense. All right, you win. Get a contract from Kat and start whenever you want. She didn't know it, but she was putting a lot of pressure on me. Now 3 people needed payment, and there would likely be more soon. I needed to figure out a budget. The Attorney General had been helpful, giving me a temporary office and some extra equipment and supplies. Hiring outside help for a short time was a common trick to avoid long-term rules, but I still needed a proper budget. When my team turned in their payment requests, I had to make sure I had money to pay them. I needed to request a budget. I didn't like doing it, but I felt I had no other choice. I had to swallow my pride and stay positive. Becoming a politician wasn't my dream, but as my mother often says, you can't always get what you want. His office was very bright, with sunshine pouring through the windows, but Sullivan didn't seem to mind. We sat in 2 comfy chairs by a small love seat and a coffee table. The coffee he poured looked strong. My mother also says, the only thing worse than a bad loser is a rude winner. I had fought Sullivan and lost. I almost won, but he came out ahead. He controlled the judges, which I knew, but where he really defeated my friend Steve and me was with the court clerk. He got us removed from the court schedule and kept us off it. You can appeal a decision, but it's really hard to appeal if nothing happens at all. Because of this, I was now tied down and likely to stay that way. My question now was Saul a nice winner? You take yours black? No sugar, I believe, Mr. Sullivan, Solomon said, handing me a delicate cup of strong coffee. Yes, thank you, I replied. Looking at the cup, I noticed the pretty pink rose design. It reminded me of my Aunt Sophia's china. He saw me looking. I don't have many left. They belong to my grandmother. I like having them around, a reminder of where I came from, he said. Do you miss it? I asked. Sometimes, but what I miss is mostly gone. New York can be quite a dull place, and it changes quickly. Take you as an example. A year ago, you were a small-time assistant district attorney, and now you're the important state special counsel for public corruption. What you do from here on, good or bad, changes your life and the lives of many others, even those you might never meet, he said thoughtfully. The problem is, I have no budget, I said, getting to the point. Yes, but surely you've talked about this with the governor, he said with a knowing smile. The governor told me when he appointed me that he would include my office in the next budget, but until then I have to rely on the AG. That just doesn't work. I need to hire my own team, which means I have to find a way to pay for them. It's tricky to ask the lawmakers for money to pay someone who is looking into them, especially if that person is not well known to them, he said, thinking it over. I'm looking for some advice, I said, returning to what brought me here and wondering how difficult he would make it for me. Saul smiled and replied, What you really need is a good lobbyist or 2. I might know someone. Now it was my turn to smile. Someone? Pat, you need to see yourself as an important person. Important people know how to get what they want. There will be an extra budget in July, and with the right help, you could get some temporary funding. Can you help me with that? I asked, feeling uncomfortable but realizing he was trying to make it easier for me. Yes, I believe I can. I can't make promises, but if you hire me, I will do my best to help you, he said, smiling. He seemed happy to have me as his client. Then we should talk about payment, I said. Mr. Sullivan, I'm a lobbyist, which is why you're hiring me. My job is to influence the people who make the laws. There are many ways to do that, and some are even legal, he said, laughing. However, helping the person who will reveal their secrets will show them I have influence where it matters. I'm not asking for favors, just for your appreciation, he said sincerely. And in terms of my firm, I'm doing a favor for the husband of one of our partners, he added, leaning back. Well, I can't argue with that. Do we need a written agreement, or will a handshake work? A handshake will be just fine. Saul was gracious, and from what I heard, he knew when to choose the right side. Brandt came to see me. To keep it brief, he had talked to the FBI. Thankfully, they only asked about the night of the attack on me and what he had seen and done. "I'm worried," he said. "No one would believe the story about biker gang revenge. The person I shot wasn't a biker. Don't worry, you're not involved in any illegal activities. As long as you didn't know anything ahead of time and didn't cover it up later, you're in the clear. The key now is to avoid any conspiracy charges," I said. "That's easy for you to say, but just because I'm not charged doesn't mean I'm free and clear. I'm important in the sheriff's office now. When the current sheriff retires, I could run for the position. If you're on my team, we could win. Worst case, I get a good pension. But all of that could be ruined if that guy talks." That was the core of the matter. Anyone who knew or suspected that Laura and Patterson had an affair could point fingers. If you knew that I tricked him and got that greedy guy to pay for the money that helped me become the district attorney, you would understand what happened next. Patterson took his shot but only managed to hurt me a little. It wasn't over yet, but now the FBI was in the picture. If they found out about Laura's relationship, she and Patterson would be seen as suspects for the attack on me. "That guy was so scared the night I arrested him. He won't last a minute facing an attempted murder charge. We need to act," Brandt insisted. "No, you need to stay out of this. There are too many people involved already." It was ironic that a special prosecutor for corruption found himself in this mess. I knew something had to change. I felt stuck. The situation just kept getting worse. I hoped I had calmed Brandt down. I understood his worries. This all started with his daughter in trouble, but now he had moved up in the world. It's hard to go back down when you are caught in a scandal created by someone who didn't realize how lucky they were. His last words were still bothering me. "I'm not the only one I warned," he had said. When I returned to my office, Phil was there. He had written everything out in pencil on 3 sheets of yellow paper. I knew why it wasn't typed up. Some of it was obtained in ways that were not allowed, but that was the important stuff. "Okay, give me the official report from the prison and leave the rest out. I'll blanket the prison and the hospital with subpoenas, but we will probably only need the wife and the Reverend to get an indictment. I think Senator Hoffman will plead guilty once he realizes we know," I told a very quiet Sloan. He had done well, but he didn't seem proud of himself. "Are you okay, Phil?" I asked. "Yeah, just feeling guilty," he replied, and I didn't push him to explain. 2 days after I served Mrs. Hoffman with a subpoena to testify, I had an unexpected visitor. I had set up a plan to start showing evidence to a grand jury. The Attorney General had one ready for a commercial fraud case, and I was borrowing it for my presentation about the Hoffman case. You can show anything you want to a grand jury as long as you have the authority. "Well, Stephen, what brings you here?" I said, looking at my best friend. "I represent Janet Hoffman," he said calmly, as if he were inviting me to lunch. Mary Ellen, who was sitting next to me taking notes, nearly fell out of her chair. I had asked her to observe because I didn't want claims of favoritism later, but I had thought he was coming for the husband, not the victim. "How can I help your client?" I asked. "Cancel your subpoena," he said. His tone told me he meant business. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that," I replied. "Then I'm here to inform you that my client will use her Fifth Amendment rights," he said coolly and matter-of-factly. I thought Mary was going to explode, but she stayed quiet. "Fine, I'll give her immunity," I said, trying to stay as calm as she was. "In that case, she'll use spousal privilege," he replied, a grin spreading across his face. He clearly found this amusing. Mary couldn't hold back anymore. "You can't use spousal privilege for a crime against your partner," she said, showing off her knowledge of the law. "That's enough, Mary," I said, giving her a cold look. Then I turned to Stephen. "Thank you for the heads up, counselor. I appreciate it." "My pleasure, Pat. After all, we're friends," he responded. After he left, Mary felt bad for speaking out, but she was sure that Stephen was just pretending. "I don't think so. He was sending a message," I said. "Okay, what was the message?" she asked. "That's the puzzle. Let's see if we can figure it out. You check Sloan's official report while I look through his notes." The next day I felt uneasy, thinking I had overlooked something important. Laura was pacing around as the FBI began questioning people at her workplace. She was a suspect since we were going through a divorce when things got really tense. They clearly didn't believe that drug dealers were after me. "It's all my fault," Laura said that night over the spaghetti dinner I made. I had clearly told her to stay out of the kitchen. She couldn't even make coffee or boil water. But there she was, cooking steaks. She burnt the microwave with baked potatoes and somehow broke a fancy food processor we had. I still couldn't figure that one out. We were having spaghetti because she suddenly wanted it. She usually wasn't good in the kitchen, but now she was a real hazard. Except for her legal work, she seemed lost most of the time. How she managed at work was a mystery, but Saul assured me she was doing fine there. After each doctor's visit, her doctor called me to say I needed to take better care of my wife. Her pregnancy was challenging in many ways. She was often sick and occasionally very needy. It was hard to think straight with a pregnant woman who was almost always in the mood. It made things frustrating for me, especially since I was still struggling with what had happened with Patterson. We were in a tense relationship, and I planned to end it after the baby was born, hopefully with her agreeing to it. "It's not all your fault, and as much as I hate to say it, you're the least to blame in this situation," I told her. That seemed to calm her a bit. She didn't look well at all. I wanted to hire someone to help around the house, but she refused, and I didn't have any money. I knew she was afraid I would leave her if I got the chance and enough funds. It was a tricky situation for everyone involved. "What should I do if the FBI wants to talk to me?" she asked. "You tell them no. You can ask them to send their questions in writing, and you will answer them after talking to your lawyer," I replied. "But that will make me look guilty," she said. "Laura, you are guilty. You had an affair. You watched while your husband tried to bully your lover. Then you stayed quiet when your lover tried to hurt your husband," I said. "That's not true! Frank would never do that!" she shouted. The conversation stopped because, as I warned her, she got sick again. She had morning sickness that lasted all day long, and it didn't go away after the first few months. When we talked again, she still insisted that Frank couldn't have done the things I knew he had done. She was stuck in her guilt, and I was too proud to just accept what she had done. We ended the talk and went to sleep in separate beds, both worn out and troubled. The next day, I found an important piece of evidence in the Hoffman case. My friend Stephen already knew about it, but he couldn't tell me while he was representing the Hoffmans. I discovered it hidden in a police report from the night Mrs. Hoffman went to the hospital. A police officer had looked at Senator Hoffman's car, the one he used to drive his wife to the hospital. There was blood on the passenger seat and floor. They could check the car without a warrant because it was a state vehicle. It was a questionable choice, but I didn't need anything inside the car. The police didn't make any arrests that night because Mrs. Hoffman claimed she had just fallen. But why did Hoffman use a state car? The answer was easy to find. He had been at a public meeting in Rochester earlier that evening after going to another meeting in Syracuse. In fact, he had been traveling across upstate New York promoting his unpopular views on natural gas drilling. I did the math and realized that the senator had never been interviewed, only accused. He had also not defended himself. Frank Patterson felt like a car was following him. It was an ordinary, later-model sedan that appeared and disappeared, but always came back as he checked his rearview mirror. His Mercedes GT was not hard to follow through city traffic. He was worried. There had been whispers about an FBI investigation. He needed to be cautious. Ever since he got involved with Laura Parker, Frank's life had not felt normal. Her husband was not like the others. Usually, husbands accepted things when he was with their wives. Frank was a wealthy partner in a strong law firm. He was handsome and the kind of confident man that women often liked. How could he be set up and pressured by a low-level assistant district attorney and his weak lawyer friend? It was embarrassing. In a small place like New York's capital, where everyone knows each other, this just wasn't right. He felt he had to respond. How could he let this slide? He could see the smirking Fitzgerald laughing at him since Sullivan had gotten the upper hand. Frank always thought of himself as the top dog. He was big, had gone to great schools, and had always been well off. But now those two had taken his money and hurt his pride. Afterward, Saul Solomon had treated him like a child, telling him to keep his personal life to himself and warning him to stay away from Sullivan. Solomon made it clear that Sullivan was going places and could be trouble. So what did that make Frank? Just a loser? "Do you always drive this slow?" asked the pretty woman in the Mercedes. She wasn't his usual type. He usually liked women who were more upscale and sometimes married. The waitress Trina was attractive but single and had kids. He first met her in a bar where she worked, then saw her again at a coffee shop near his office. In the bar, she had been distant, but later at the coffee shop, she was all smiles. She wasn't really his type, but since Solomon had shut him out of his usual fun, he figured he would take what he could get. Plus, she knew how to have a good time. "I'm just being careful. I want to get us there safe," he replied. "I just thought you'd be more eager," she said, and giggling. Despite himself, he pressed the gas pedal more. "Mr. Rosencrantz, that's enough," Judge Thompson said, sounding frustrated. "But, Your Honor, my client is being denied his rights," Attorney Matthew Rosencrantz repeated for what felt like the 10th time. Matt wasn't a bad lawyer. He just had a tough case. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who graduated from Cornell Law at 27 and joined the family law firm. He had a decent career thanks to his persistence and friendly nature, but he was wearing out Judge Thompson's patience. "For the last time, if Mr. Sullivan mistakenly gives your client immunity from prosecution, he can't refuse to testify," the judge said, then directed his frustration at me. "Don't think I won't report this matter to the right people, Mr. Sullivan. I don't know what shady deal has been made, but I won't stay silent." The judge seemed a bit hot-headed, but then again, people said I could be too. In the grand jury room, Senator Hoffman's look was a mix of fear and anger. The jury members did not seem to have much sympathy for him. One of the deputy attorney generals working with the jury had pulled me aside and briefed me on what they were like. They're mostly older, which is pretty common. They sat quietly for a while, which was easier without any urgent tasks. The leader of the group was an Asian Indian woman in her 60s. She was a proud citizen and took her responsibilities seriously. She had learned about the grand jury process and knew she could ask questions. It was a bit tricky for me. If I could choose again, I wouldn't have picked her. "The others can follow your lead if you need," she said. The Deputy Attorney General then looked me over, giving me one of those friendly smiles I had been getting from several women on his team. It had become such a problem that Sid Levy had pulled me aside to ask if I wanted him to step in. I asked him not to because I was trying hard to keep things respectful between our teams. I wanted to avoid any tension from some friendly glances, a few comments, and a little accidental touching. He walked away, shaking his head, and said, "Things were simpler when all you had to do was look out for the women on staff." His challenge was that he had more women than men working as attorneys, thanks to his effort to provide equal job opportunities at a time when more women were graduating from law schools. These women were serious about their careers and were either looking for partners or having fun. Many of the male staff were gay, some from previous leaders, while others were drawn to the welcoming work environment. This situation meant there were very few straight men, making it an unusual scene in the office. Great for the guys, unless a jealous or unhappy partner was involved. As I entered the jury room to speak with Senator Hoffman, I hoped that if the meeting went well, I might get my own office space. When he was sworn in, the senator quickly claimed spousal privilege. "To what, Senator?" I asked. "To everything," he replied. I noticed the woman taking notes out of the corner of my eye. "You need to wait for me to ask a question," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "Want to check with your lawyer about that?" "No," he answered. "All right. When did you get home on March 25th this year?" I asked. "I can't remember." "You brought your wife to Mercy General at 9:46 p.m., I said, showing him the records. "So, it must have been before then." He didn't say anything, so I continued. "Witnesses say you left Rochester just before 8 p.m., is that right?" "Yes," he replied reluctantly. "How long does it usually take you to get home?" I asked. He seemed hesitant, but knew what I was getting at. "Maybe 45 minutes to an hour." The state police say that the trip would take at least an hour and 10 minutes in good weather, but that night there was a storm affecting Rochester, I added. "I'm sorry, is it snowing?" "Yes," he replied, his voice barely loud enough to hear. I leaned closer to him. "Senator, you barely had time to get home, find your wife in trouble, and get her to the hospital. If you didn't hurt her, who did?" We were staring at each other as I asked. Hoffman clenched his jaw and answered, "I won't say anything about my wife." I stepped back and noticed the jury forewoman raising her hand. I turned to her and said, "Can he do that?" she asked. I turned back to Hoffman before I replied. Maybe. It's a tricky situation. What he knows must have come from his wife, since she told him because he is her husband. But whether he can hide behind that here is questionable. He thinks I will push him for an answer and that'll make him look bad in the news, but I won't do that. Hoffman glared at me, his anger evident. "You're a fool, Sullivan," he said, then turned to the jury. "You don't know this man. He's not the innocent person he pretends to be. He is a political manipulator. As a teenager, he almost attacked a priest. As a prosecutor, he'll do anything to win. He is part of our governor's team and his political friends. Please trust me. I'm trying to protect my family. You all have families too. Would you let them suffer so politicians can act like they care about justice?" Tears streamed down his face, soaking his dress shirt. "Where was your son that night?" I asked after he finished speaking, as if I hadn't heard his earlier words. "What?" "You heard me, Jerry Jr. Your daughter Alice was in her dorm at NYU. They keep good records. But where was your son?" I moved closer. "There's nothing to hide there. How can you be so cruel? Senator, by now you know that I know. About your wife's affair and what happened because of it. Do we need to bring in witnesses?" I said, then turned to the jury. I gestured to them for effect. "These good people are smart. They understand that if you couldn't have done it, someone else must have had a reason," I said, and I could see the realization dawning on the jurors. "So, where was your son?" Hoffman looked defeated. "I promised Elsa, my wife," he said. "Just tell us the truth. There's no point in hiding it now." And with that, he opened up. His wife had wanted their son with her when she told him about the pregnancy. She hadn't expected how he would react. Junior hurt her with a hard punch. She was standing in the dining room and fell down 2 steps into the living room. She hit a small table but seemed to be okay except for a black eye. An hour later, she started to lose the baby. At that point, their son had left, angry but sorry for what he had done. When Mr. Hoffman arrived home to find his wife badly hurt and in pain, he quickly took her to the hospital, which was about 10 minutes away. After this, the family tried to hide the crime while society pushed for consequences for the husband, whether he was guilty or not. I asked the jury not to charge the senator. They agreed, but, "Can we not charge the son?" the head juror asked. "Isn't that our responsibility?" "I'm sorry, but I can't charge him. He doesn't hold an elected position, and I can only act on those who do," I explained. This wasn't how some may see my role, but I decided to stand firm. "However," I continued, thinking about her question, "you can send the issue to the local district attorney and the state attorney general with your reasons." And that's exactly what they did. The Albany Times-Union mentioned it on page 4. It wasn't major news, but was an event that was happening more often. A well-known lawyer was found dead in his home. Drugs were suspected, another sad event in the rising number of famous people struggling with addiction. Local police arrived first, but soon handed the scene over to the state police. The FBI wanted to help, but were told to leave. They were not allowed to be there, and people of influence were worried. Frank Patterson had more friends in death than he did in life. The investigation was quick and clear. Frank had died from a heroin overdose. He had likely snorted or taken the drug in some way. When found, Frank had been dead for several days. What he did on the day he died was unclear. Those who saw him that evening thought he might have been with a dark-haired woman, but no one recognized her. She was not one of his usual friends. In any case, there was no evidence of anyone else's involvement. Frank's drinking issues and lifestyle seemed to show he might have tried a drug he didn't know well. The state police said it was an accidental overdose, but many people had doubts. Yet all they had were doubts. The release of the grand jury's decision had to be handled carefully. I wanted to keep the news quiet. Fridays are busy for news, so by releasing it late Thursday, I hoped it would get lost in the rush. It was a plan. Thursday at 4:45, we made the announcement. At 5:30, Kat entered my office. "I thought you left for the day," I said. "The lobby is full of reporters and camera crews looking for you," she replied. I sighed, feeling frustrated that I couldn't escape this. Just delay it. "All right. Let's say there will be a press conference tomorrow at noon while I slip out through the garage," I said, hoping things would be less important by the next day. I got home without any problems, only to find reporters waiting on my lawn. There weren't many news sources around, just the cable news and 2 local newspapers. As I moved slowly on my crutches toward my front door, I tried to avoid them, hoping to escape their questions about the news conference the next day. But they surprised me by asking for my thoughts on something Stephen Fitzgerald had said. "What did Mr. Fitzgerald say?" I replied. The woman from the cable news held a microphone closer and said, "Foxy claims you can't make a case, so you are dodging the problem." I chuckled a little and said, "Maybe he thinks he can do a better job," as I slipped inside my house, leaving them with only a small comment. Stephen was just doing his part in this ongoing situation. When I stepped inside, I felt something was off. The house was dark and quiet, even though Laura's car was in the driveway. She was in the back bedroom, likely still asleep. We hadn't been sharing a bed lately. First, it was because of my own physical and emotional issues, but later it was also about her. She wasn't sleeping well. They say some women have a glow during pregnancy, but that wasn't true for Laura. While her belly grew, she became thinner everywhere else. Her face looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. She didn't seem herself. Honestly, I had not been a good husband or soon-to-be father. My pride and anger had hurt her, and I had become indifferent, caught up in my own problems at the office. Now I found her lying on the bed, fully dressed, breathing heavily, and her skin looked a sickly gray. I tried to wake her, but she didn't respond. I dialed 911. The ambulance came while the cable news crew was still hanging around. They were filming everything as the paramedics carried Laura out to the ambulance. I went to the hospital with her. Once we arrived, they took me to a waiting room where I could see everything being reported on the TV. 2 hours later, I met Laura's doctor, a woman in her late 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was about 5'4" and looked very upset. "What part of being a husband and father don't you understand, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked sharply. "Things are a bit tough in our marriage right now," I replied. "So, when I've told you for months that your wife needed to work less and eat more, you haven't been listening? You've missed the signs. Did you even notice whether she was eating or taking the vitamins I told her to?" she said, giving me a disappointed look. "We haven't eaten together much since she had that kitchen accident. I tried a few times, but she hasn't been able to keep her food down," I admitted, feeling bad for leaving a woman who struggled with cooking. She shook her head. "Your wife is dehydrated, very underweight, and anemic. That's just her. The baby, I'm afraid, will be low birth weight, which can create many other problems. Now I think you need to get it together and start acting like a husband and a future father." With that, she left me to think about my own mistakes. They allowed me into Laura's room, but she was still asleep. A kind nurse told me that she was stable and would be okay. I settled into a quite uncomfortable chair and waited. We were in the intensive care unit for the night. I was told it was a privilege to stay there because of the situation. Between feeling guilty and the hard chair, I didn't sleep much. Early the next morning, Laura woke up, and they were getting her ready to move to another room. They were bringing her breakfast, and it was not optional. I stayed to make sure she ate. I wanted to talk to her, but before I could, Susan Singleton walked in. "Laura, what's going on? You're all over the news," Susan said. Laura looked guilty and embarrassed. "I had a rough time yesterday. I think I overdid it," she said softly. "Well, prepare for some visitors. The governor is coming to see you," Susan said excitedly. The hospital staff was buzzing with excitement. The governor was visiting, and the media was coming with him. They moved Laura into a private room and made sure she looked her best. Security arrived, and everyone, from hospital managers to Laura's tired doctor, was asked to leave. Edward Kincaid came into the room by himself and sent Susan out. He shook my hand and patted my shoulder. "Great job on the Hoffman case, Pat. I knew I chose you for a reason," the governor said, then turned to Laura. "You gave us a scare, young woman, but your doctor says you will be okay. Are we having a boy or a girl?" he asked. "A girl, Governor," she replied. "Just call me Ed or Gov when it's just us. I'm glad you're feeling better, but I need to borrow your husband for a few minutes. I'll send him back soon and tell him to stay with you until you're better." Then he pulled me aside. "What do I need to know about the Hoffman case?" he asked. I quickly updated him. "Who else knows this?" he asked. "My investigator, Phil Sloan, and of course the hospital staff who treated Miss Hoffman," I replied. "Okay, keep it quiet while I try to help Hoffman's career. Now we need to go out and reassure the public that everything is fine, especially with Laura here. That's right. Everything is fine with your wife. No silly problems from the past, he said with a serious look. I nodded, realizing I'd put myself in a situation I didn't want to be in. The press conference that followed was short and straightforward. Jerry Hoffman was a good man wrongly accused. The people of the state owed thanks to the hard-working special prosecutor who had sacrificed so much to make things right. I took my moment, and then I was bombarded with questions about my wife's health. Laura had made a big impact with the news about the case. But things were not easy. A reporter from the Rochester Gazette kept asking questions. He wanted to know about Jerry Jr. and why he wasn't facing charges. I gave my usual response about the law. Just then, Susan stepped in. "I think it's time for the special prosecutor to get back to his wife," she said, ending the press conference. After that, I could go back to Laura's room. She was sleeping. Around noon, Kat called. I gave her a statement about the case, but it didn't really say much. She went to read it to the reporters, explaining that I was unavailable because of a family emergency. They wanted to know how Laura was doing. Kat told them she was fine and resting. The nurse woke Laura up at 12:45 for lunch. It was time for a talk. "What's going on, Laura?" I asked. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I didn't mean to cause any," she replied. "Why haven't you been eating?" "I just feel sick." "You could have told me you were having a hard time." "I couldn't. What could I say? I'm failing as a wife, and now I might fail as a mother." "You aren't going to fail as a mother. We'll figure out your meals, keep you home and rested. Solomon can manage without you for a bit." "I wish it were that easy," she said. "I've tried, I promise." "Now we will try together," I said. "You don't really mean that." "Don't tell me what I mean. Right now we're in this as a team. Just accept it," I said firmly. She started to cry. I didn't understand why. The nurse came in and asked me to step out for a while. I spent the next 3 days at the hospital before they finally let her go home. Meanwhile, the outside world continued. Reporters were calling my office for news and trying to sneak into the hospital. On the 3rd day, the doctor called me aside. "I'm ready to send your wife home. That means home, not work. She needs someone with her all the time for now. She is stable, but we want to keep it that way. I've arranged for a home nurse to help. I suggest you hire a home health aide, too." She looked at me as if she anticipated a disagreement. "I'm not the issue here. Laura is struggling to accept help. She thinks it's a failure," I said. "She is feeling down. I think it relates to your marriage situation. You should try to stay positive for her and for the baby," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Marriage isn't easy, and being a parent is even harder. Sometimes you must do what's best for your family, not just what you want. It's time to grow up." I wanted to argue, but she was right. Dawn, my therapist, had good suggestions for home health help. We hired a friendly woman in her 40s, a mother of 3. She clicked well with Laura and provided much-needed support. She had many ways to keep her spirits high and make sure the food stayed down for the soon-to-be mother. Things were looking better until we got a phone call. Kat answered first, then it was passed to Mary Ellen. The caller wanted to speak to the boss. "This is Jack Rubens from the Rochester," he started, but I interrupted. "I know who you are, Mr. Rubens, and what your call is about. My staff already told you we have no comment." "I still have questions," he said. "Then go ahead." "You know about Elsa Hoffman's affair and the miscarriage. How did you find out?" I could hear how pleased he was with himself. He felt he had done his job and wanted to get the most out of it. "The real question is how you found out, Mr. Rubens. I can only guess that you paid someone, maybe even public officials," I replied. "My sources are private," he answered. "Yes, but I would prefer to take legal action against you," I said, trying to bluff. "You're crazy. How could you do that?" he replied. "The law you mentioned doesn't say what I can or can't do," I explained. "Yes, but I know you must have done something wrong to get this information," he said. "Too bad there's no one going after me," I said. "So do you want to make a statement or not?" he asked. "If your article is fair and not too scandalous, I won't ask how you learned what you did. I'll even send you a copy of my report to the legislature the day I file it," I said. "Are you really filing a report on the Hoffman case?" he inquired. "No, just a regular report that covers our activities and what my staff found in our investigations," I clarified. "When can I see this report?" he asked. "Well, today is Wednesday, so I'd say next Tuesday," I replied. A few days later, Jack Rubin published his story in the Rochester Gazette. He was very balanced. He told the tale of the Hoffmans' long marriage and described Elsa's injury as unintentional. He suggested that my office had uncovered much of this information, but added that it was just a guess. The tabloids in New York City were not as nice. They opened with side-by-side photos of Mrs. Hoffman and her lover. I had asked Mary Ellen to write our response. She did an excellent job. Phil came off like a detective, and I appeared as a skilled prosecutor who took a chance and succeeded. Our version didn't mention the miscarriage because we believed it wasn't supported by the facts. The affair seemed credible based on witnesses at the prison. But there was no doubt about Senator Hoffman's innocence due to his travel that night. "Hello, Macher," Saul Solomon said when I answered the phone. "Do you know what that means?" he asked. "Yiddish for big shot," I replied. 10 million big. You got funded," he said. "The Democrats wanted to help you out, but the other side wanted to make sure you were content, so they changed things a bit and gave you a salary equal to the governor's," he said. "Thank you," I replied, and I really meant it. "I'm happy to help, but you did a great job. You might just become a politician yet." "Did you read the Times today?" Saul asked. "No, I try to avoid the city news." "Check out the editorial maker," he said, and then hung up. New York Times, July 8, 2014. The governor made a smart choice. Many people, including us, wondered if Governor Edward Kincaid's pick for a role to fight corruption was the right fit. Patrick X. Sullivan, a little-known former prosecutor from Van Patten County, was young and had little experience. He had gained some recognition for his bravery against a dangerous drug gang. He was a straightforward young man who was not known for being very skilled in law or politics. His close connection to the governor, who had mentored him, also raised concerns in a job that clearly needed someone independent. However, those who doubted him were mistaken. With talent and boldness, the young prosecutor has shown that he is more than capable of his job. He has handled a tough situation well and helped restore the reputation of a respected public servant. Sullivan did this despite facing some personal challenges and at a notable cost to himself. Now it's up to the lawmakers to fund the office you created, now that the right person is in place. Meanwhile, I had one last issue to deal with. Laura was over 7 months pregnant. She was feeling better physically, but we still had concerns. I had greatly misjudged her. She had seemed so confident and in control, climbing the ladder at the corporate law firm. She was the type of person who always exceeded expectations. How could I have known she was just putting on a strong front, hiding her insecurities? What I thought was strength turned out to be a weakness. She wasn't looking at me as a partner. I was the support she needed to lean on. She felt weak, while I felt strong, and she had expected me to be there for her no matter what. She had manipulated me as part of her strategy. She struggled to win fair, often bending the rules. This wasn't like Stephen, who cheated for fun, or me, who played to win. My beautiful wife was trying to cheat to survive. Laura's main worry was that she couldn't cheat the baby who was getting ready to be born. As the time got closer, her fear only grew stronger. She had chosen names, Bridget for my mother and Ellen for hers. Both our families were excitedly waiting for little Bridget E. Sullivan. I was swinging on the unique set that Laura and Don had put up in the backyard. It was a comfy seat. I held Bridget in my arms, and her mother was close by. My daughter had 10 tiny fingers and toes, and they all wrapped around my heart. I began to love her the moment she was born, weighing just 6 pounds and 2 ounces. She had a few dark hairs then, and now, 6 weeks later, I noticed some strands of white. My mother had mentioned that she would probably have red hair, saying, "That's how you began. Colorless." After the relatives left following the birth, it was just the 2 of us and some help around the house. Laura was stepping up as a wonderful mother. She was the type who liked to achieve a lot. She had given birth without complaining and was out of the hospital the same day, even though the doctors advised her to stay longer. She told me, or maybe warned me, that she wouldn't be using birth control anymore. "If you stay with me, this is going to be a traditional marriage. I'll work part-time because I'm still learning to be a good housewife. But I'll be in the kitchen most of the time and probably expecting another baby," she said. "No way," I replied. "Pat, please, I want to make this work." "Laura, okay, yes to being in the kitchen, but about having another baby, that depends on you behaving. The kitchen is off limits for anything else, I said. She laughed and said, Fine, just in the kitchen then. After that, she hugged me and asked, Am I forgiven? No, but I love you and our daughter, so I'll stay. Plus, you're good for my image. And she was, getting nice attention in the news after the birth. I did forgive her, but I wouldn't say it out loud. When it came to worrying about whether she would stay faithful, I remembered the stories about Frank. Most people assumed something must have happened to him. It would take a lot of courage for someone to try to win over Mrs. Sullivan, as everyone now referred to my wife. I handed our daughter, Bridget, to her. I have to go. They are waiting for me, I said. She nodded and gave me a faint smile. Please, don't be gone too long. I miss you when you're away. I won't be long, just a quick meeting with some politicians. She didn't say what was on her mind, which was that a politician was exactly what I had become. It felt strange, since I didn't think I fit the job well, but as I stepped out, I took a long look at Laura with our baby in her arms. She had such a bright smile, and I realized I had never seen her so happy and relaxed before. All her worries seemed to fade. This was my family, and I would do anything to protect them. The memorial service took place in a small church in Troy near the Hudson River. It was a newer church by Troy's standards, built in the mid-19th century. It was made of a type of stone called Manhattan sandstone, often called brownstone. The stones were solid and showed signs of age but were still strong. You could see small grooves in the foundation from when the Hudson River flooded over the years. A junior associate from the firm had planned the service well. Frank Patterson had been listed as a Methodist, but the church was one of Troy's Episcopal places, known for its beautiful stained glass windows and open-mindedness. Death by drug overdose was not a big concern. The person who passed away and a few others at the service were Episcopalians, but this did not change much. Most people at any church service were not Episcopalian. Being Christian was nice, but it wasn't necessary. The black priest who led the service did not know the deceased, but he performed his role well. He respected the one-year anniversary of the death. Saul Solomon felt happy with the turnout and the service he thought was right for remembering a member of the firm who was gone. Everything went well. Several staff members spoke fondly of Frank, including Saul, who made it clear he saw this death as a sad accident. He already said he would not allow any rumors to spread, either in the office or elsewhere. As Saul left the church, he walked under the beautiful stained glass at the back that showed the kingdom of heaven. Laura was not there. She was in San Francisco for important work and avoided the awkward chance of seeing her husband at the service. As Saul went through the church entrance, shaking the priest's hand and thanking him, he noticed Stephen Fitzgerald waiting on the church steps. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fitzgerald. I'm glad you could come, but I'm a bit surprised given the situation," Saul said. "The man was a client, even if just for a short while, Mr. Solomon, and please call me Foxy," Stephen replied with a small smile, as if he found the situation funny. "Then you can call me Sal," Saul said. "Sal it is. I'm just waiting for my wife to pick me up," Fitzgerald said. "My wife Martha is getting our Lincoln," Saul replied. "Ah, much more practical than a sports car. You know my wife Susan, I believe?" Steve said. "Yes, she is a lovely woman." "You are very lucky," Saul said. "Yes, at times like this it's good to remember one's blessings." Saul thought for a moment and decided to ask a question he thought might not get an answer. "Some people still think Frank met with foul play. What do you think?" he asked. Stephen paused and then spoke seriously. "I see Frank's choices as a series of bad decisions that ended in tragedy. Every action has a result. It's troubling that these results are not always easy to see in advance," Stephen said. "But when you take on much stronger opponents, losing should be expected. You speak wisely as someone who has faced many tough challenges in life. A good Jewish kid from Brooklyn who has used his smarts to succeed and enjoy a good life with his lovely wife," Stephen said with a slight smirk. "So, he underestimated you, Foxy." "It was the cleverness of a fox, not the strength of a wolf," Saul replied, hinting at what he suspected. Stephen smiled. "Just a guess without proof." "Did the wolf get there before or after that priest hurt you?" Saul asked, some anger creeping into his voice. Stephen didn't seem bothered by it. "Somewhere in between," he said. "You should have seen the priest's face. He chose a place where no one could hear me, but Pat is very protective. When he really loses his temper, he goes from dangerous to deadly. Thankfully, someone heard the priest's screams, Stephen said blankly. I think you're just as dangerous when you want to be, Foxy, Saul said. A fox has to use his wits, not just his feelings. Only do what's needed. As I said, actions have consequences, but my ride is here, he said as he got ready to leave. Saul watched a shiny new Mercedes pull away, and in its place came his wife's Lincoln town car. He walked over to the passenger door and got inside. Martha turned to him. Is something wrong, Sal? You look a bit off, she said. I'm fine. Just trying to think about my mistakes, he said, still feeling bad about what had happened to Frank Patterson. You should be careful about messing with someone's wife, especially someone like Sullivan. If you walk away unharmed, you should consider yourself lucky. To fight back would be risky. If it hadn't been Fitzgerald, someone else would have been involved. Still, Saul felt that guilt inside. Martha glanced at her husband. Well, it was a lovely service. You should be proud. It's too bad Laura and her nice husband couldn't make it, she said.
What's up, story lovers? This is the Story Guy, and if you're hungry for crazy tales and mind-blowing narratives, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our weekly dose of crazy cheating stories, fun fiction and gut-ripping comedy from around the world. But that's not all. We also create our own original stories, and trust me, you won't find these anywhere else. Want even more spine-tingling reads? Head down to the description and grab our exclusive story collections. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.